Sometimes reality becomes unbearably cruel, erasing all hope for the mercy of fate. The main character of this story, by an unfair twist of fate, found herself completely alone. The girl sat in an empty church, and all she could do was pray to God, hoping for at least some mercy and long-awaited forgiveness. There were times when the orphan did not feel hatred towards God, but now she sincerely and desperately asked to give her at least one more chance to fix everything and change her sad fate. If God had given her even the slightest chance to change everything, the girl would never have repeated the same stupid and fatal mistake that destroyed her whole life. But now it seemed that life had no mercy on the young miss. Due to a serious illness, the poor fellow had almost no strength left even to simply rise from the cold floor. The heroine clearly felt that she was dying, but she could do nothing about it. How could the girl not want to say goodbye to life, finding herself in such a helpless and frightening position? Bright sunlight softly illuminated the spacious and luxuriously decorated room of the ancient castle, filling it with a warm glow and creating a feeling of unexpected comfort. The story's protagonist slowly opened her eyes, trying to recall the moment she fell asleep after losing consciousness. Now her breathing became noticeably easier, as if a long sleep had restored her strength. But when the miss approached the mirror, she could not believe her eyes. In front of her, the girl saw clear skin and lively long hair, which she had only had in her youth. The appearance of the young and completely healthy lady spoke of only one thing: the girl had somehow returned to her distant and forgotten past. However, the heroine was not at all happy with this transformation. In a fit of anger, the girl grabbed the largest vase and threw it on the floor with all her might. This was not at all what she wanted. The main character of this story is Bianca de Arnaud, Countess of Arnaud of Sevran, who was notorious among the country's inhabitants for being a cruel and cold wife. Her husband, Count Zachary de Arnaud, was not only a loyal vassal of His Majesty the King of Sevran, but also a reliable right hand of the prince, His Highness Gautier. While the Count risked his life daily on the battlefield, he invariably sent home many expensive dresses, made especially for Madame Bianca. The young man showered his companion with luxurious gifts, buying her exquisite jewelry created by famous and respected artisans of the city. Sometimes she locked herself in her chambers, screaming like a madwoman, and in fits of rage, breaking furniture with her hands, unable to cope with her emotions. Now the reborn miss sat on her bed in horror. Meanwhile, the maids were discussing with all their might that several days had already passed since Bianca stopped eating and calling the maids to clean the room. Some of the maids were already thinking about entering without an invitation, as something serious might have happened that required immediate intervention. However, there were also those who considered the lady's behavior to be a favorable outcome under the current circumstances. After all, everyone in the Arnaud family knew perfectly well how much suffering Madame Bianca had brought upon the Count. By their logic, such a lady would certainly suffer the punishment she deserved. Lord Arnaud was known for his extremely fickle nature, which often caused suffering to the inhabitants of his lands. However, after Count Zachary became the new lord, the situation gradually began to stabilize. Zachary de Arnaud, Bianca's husband, was a modest but principled and determined man who managed to earn a considerable fortune in the war and strengthen his position. The wicked wife, who lived in luxury, was accustomed to receiving money from her husband without any restrictions. Rumors circulated that in 9 years of marriage, they never shared a bed due to her cruel treatment. The battlefield has always been a place where no one could predict what would happen in the next minute and how everything would turn out. Some might lose their heads in a fair sword fight with an enemy, while others might meet death as a result of a cunning and insidious plan by the enemy. The maids, busy cleaning the estate, continued to discuss their mistress's personal life. The girls noted that after 9 years of marriage, Madame and the Count had produced no heirs. Meanwhile, Bianca herself tried to calm down with her favorite pastime. She carefully knitted a beautiful napkin, sitting in the silence of her bedroom. Looking at the exquisite lace, the girl recalled that this craft became her solace after the age of 30. It was in the monastery that she learned to weave such delicate patterns. Without thinking twice, the lady decided to visit her old acquaintance to clarify several important points. To this end, the lady headed to the office of Vincent, the Arnaud family's butler. With a loud scream, Bianca burst into the room, abruptly throwing open the doors, and immediately began excitedly asking the men how old she was now. Vincent calmly reminded the girl that she turned 18 this year, carefully observing her strange and unusual reaction. After this, the heroine hastened to find out where the Count was now. As it turned out, the man had left for the front a couple of months ago. Such frank questions left Vincent baffled. He knew perfectly well that the Count was indifferent to his wife, but he could not understand how the girl could not know about his absence due to the war. Madame then decided to ask the palace worker about when her husband would return. Vincent reported that in his last letter, the Count had mentioned his intention to return in the winter. After this, the lady calmly informed Vincent that she needed to get one very important thing for her in the near future. The miss explained that she could not stand the cold and hated being frozen, so she asked the butler to prepare a luxurious silver fox skin for her. Vincent had no choice but to immediately carry out Madame Arnaud's order, despite his inner doubts and surprise. After all, earlier, Monsieur de Arnaud himself ordered the servant to do absolutely everything that his wife wanted, without asking unnecessary questions. The Count often remarked that Lady Arnaud had grown up in far more wealth and privilege in Blanchefort than here. When she married him, she abandoned her former life, and the man considered it his duty to reward her Therefore, the young man made it clear to Vincent that any wish of the lady must be fulfilled flawlessly. because such was his duty as a spouse. If marriage were viewed as a transaction, then the union with Count Arno must have yielded future benefits. Otherwise, it would all have seemed in vain. Just a few hours later, the lady was already holding her luxurious new silver fox fur coat in her hands. The heroine noticed that Vincent always provided her with only the best, and this seemed to her a very commendable and respectable quality of a butler. Then the butler shared that news had arrived that morning about the Count's return. As it turned out, Bianca's husband had already returned to the country and was soon to arrive at the family estate, which was unexpected news for many. However, Bianca d'Arnaud herself remained an immature, frivolous, and cold wife who had previously shown no interest whatsoever in her husband and his fate. In the future, her name would be spoken with respect as Saint Bianca d'Arnaud, although now it was almost impossible to believe. Now the girl stood on the balcony, waiting for her husband to arrive, and looked closely at herself, increasingly realizing that she had somehow miraculously returned to life. And indeed, Bianca returned to Arno's house. As she had promised God, she intended to live her second life correctly and with dignity. The girl firmly promised herself that she would never again repeat the stupid and fatal mistake she made in her past life. Meanwhile, his lordship, along with several allies, was already approaching the kingdom. One of his companions decided to inquire how the Count was feeling, returning after such a long time. But now Zachary was thinking only about the castle, which he was looking at through the telescope. On the balcony, he noticed a girl screaming at the sky. In fact, the Count was unexpectedly pleased to see such a sincere and emotional meeting on the part of his wife. At Arno Castle, everyone was already eagerly awaiting the return of their Count to the kingdom, preparing to greet their master with dignity after a long absence. The servants' joy knew no bounds when a detachment appeared on the horizon, and that same black wolf on the banner right ahead, heralding their imminent arrival. Joyful cries filled the entire castle. Count Zachary d'Arnaud, the fierce warrior, had finally returned home after a long and grueling campaign. The Furious Warrior, this nickname was given to the Count because his silver hair was often soaked in the blood of enemies, like a sword tempered in countless battles. His silver hair inspired genuine fear and awe, causing his opponents to shudder at the mere mention of his name. A couple of minutes later, the Count's return was greeted by the estate's chief butler, Vincent, who bowed discreetly to his master. The servant reported that preparations were already in full swing in the banquet hall for a feast in honor of His Excellency's arrival and the upcoming gala evening. Like a true count, Zachary took care of his men. After a long journey and difficult battles, he allowed the knights to eat and drink to their heart's content. The knights who remained in the castle eagerly questioned the Count's confidants about the expedition. The stories were so impressive that many regretted not having participated. The army commander, Sovor, spoke enthusiastically about the campaign, as if deliberately emphasizing his own merits and presenting himself as the most outstanding knight. However, the other commanders, Gaspar and Robert, did not like this behavior of their comrade because everyone wanted to look the most worthy in the eyes of the others. Sovor was so self-confident that he was ready to boast of his exploits to anyone, even to Robert's wife, his children, and future generations. But while the commander was enthusiastically telling tales of his own bravery, the young man did not notice how Countess Bianca, quietly and almost imperceptibly, approached him from behind. One look from the lady was enough to understand that the girl had absolutely no desire to listen to the stupid and self-satisfied stories of one of the knights of the guard. As soon as the men noticed the Countess, they immediately bowed respectfully to the beauty, trying to hide their embarrassment and awkwardness. However, Bianca approached the knights only to inquire about the Count's whereabouts. Sovor replied that he had already gone up to his chambers, wishing to take a bath before dinner. As soon as the lady heard the answer, she turned around without further ado and confidently headed back to the castle, without stopping for a second. When Lady Arno left, Sovor immediately began discussing with his comrades how much the Countess had changed during her long absence. Looking at the luxurious fur on the girl's shoulders, it seemed that with age, her desires and demands only became greater and more sophisticated. Moreover, white foxes were considered extremely rare animals, and obtaining their fur was difficult even for the most experienced hunters. However, Robert immediately pulled Sovor up short, reminding him that the decisions of the Count and his family did not concern ordinary knights at all. Be that as it may, the men still did not understand why the Countess was so persistently looking for her husband right now. Sir Gaspard's question was entirely justified, for it was the first time the Countess had come out in person to greet her husband's return. However, that day, she was determined to discuss an important matter. Now the lady stood by the door, gathering her thoughts and preparing herself for a serious conversation that could change many things. Since Bianca didn't know what her husband was doing, she decided to take a discreet peek inside to make sure he wasn't talking to someone else. Meanwhile, the young man was taking off his traveling clothes and engaging in a calm conversation with Vincent. The Count was sharing his thoughts on reorganizing the estate immediately upon his return. Zachary wanted to check everything before going to bed, so he asked Vincent to prepare a detailed report of expenses for this year, as well as an accurate forecast for next year. When the man had completely undressed, he suddenly noticed that someone was watching him. In the doorway, the Count saw his wife. The embarrassed lady quickly explained that the door was open and she had no intention of peeking at him without permission. The man quickly put his clothes back on and asked Bianca why she was looking for him. He assumed it was urgent, but this assumption slightly angered the girl. The lady reproached him, saying that she did not need a special reason to simply see her own husband. after a long separation. Countess Bianca calmly explained that she had heard about the Count's return and had therefore decided to come in person to meet him. After all, Bianca was his lordship's wife, and such a visit was not only her duty, but also a completely natural desire. While talking to Zachary, the girl noticed that he was still as cold and even frighteningly calm. He stared at her silently and intently. Bianca could only wonder if he was irritated by her sudden appearance, as she had arrived unannounced when the Count was tired and busy. For a moment, the girl even considered leaving, but remembered her promise not to repeat past mistakes. If she didn't take a step forward, everything would collapse again. The lady decided to act confidently, and first of all, asked Vincent to leave, as she needed to speak with her husband alone. Soon, the butler was already standing outside the door. The time had come to put everything in its place. It was hard to believe that one day the Countess herself would decide to have a frank conversation with her husband. Zachary was surprised by his wife's behavior, but remained reserved and ready to listen to everything Bianca was going to tell him. The lady calmly clarified that she had one important proposal. The girl reminded him that she and Zachary had been married for 9 years, and now she wanted to fulfill her marital duty. The issue was about an heir. Bianca was ready to give her husband a child, and thereby strengthen the position of the Arnaud family. Now the girl came close to Count Zachary and directly stated that she wanted a child from him, without looking away. Once upon a time, the life of a noble lady depended entirely on her marriage and position in society, determining her fate. At first, the girl was looked after by her father, or the eldest man in the family, making important decisions for her, and then responsibility for her life and well-being passed to her husband and his family, becoming their responsibility. In former times, the life of a noble woman, without the support of her family and without an heir, had virtually no value. Miss lived in the shadows for a long time, remaining resentful of her fate and her own past mistakes. This is why Countess Bianca has now once again firmly stated that she wants a child from her husband. Naturally, such an unexpected statement visibly puzzled Zachary and knocked him out of his usual calm. For a moment, the man even asked again if the girl understood what exactly was needed to get pregnant. At times, the Count treated Bianca almost like a child, not taking her seriously, though in reality, things were far more complex. Although her body was only 18 years old, her mind and experience were far deeper than Zachary could have imagined. Moreover, in her past life, the girl had already shared a bed with her husband when she reached the age of 20, and she understood perfectly well what she was doing. The reborn Miss clearly remembered all the torment inflicted by the Count. How could she forget what had left such a deep mark on her soul? Now the girl stood before Zachary, confidently convincing him that she understood perfectly well what difficulties she would have to face in the future. Miss also added that the birth of an heir to the Arnaud family is her direct responsibility and duty to the family. When the man listened carefully to her words, he slowly and persistently approached, not taking his attentive gaze off her. At this point, Zachary seemed to begin to believe that the lady was truly capable of taking such a step. After all, there was only one way to conceive a child, and both understood this perfectly well without any unnecessary explanations. From the young man's reaction, Bianca immediately noticed that he was angry, despite his outward calm. Although the lady had not expected any joy from him, she was now nevertheless overcome by an unpleasant feeling of fear. At that very moment, the man noticed that the girl standing in front of him was slightly afraid of him, and this did not escape his gaze. Then the Count suggested that Miss return to her chambers and rest, since he himself needed rest after a long journey. Bianca seemed to want to say something else, but the man had already headed for the door, clearly making it clear that the conversation was over. Once again, the lady imagined the trials that awaited her if she did not have a child. She did not want to experience the same fate again. Bianca didn't want the same outcome to happen again, so she firmly grabbed the man's wrist, trying to stop him. Bianca then decided to ask Zachary how much he got for this marriage, carefully watching his reaction. The young man, when concluding the marriage contract, actually received a very good estate, which strengthened the position of the Arnaud family. The guy was promised 400 calves, 900 pigs, a significant amount of livestock and food resources, 100 silver cups, 300 bolts of silk, 2 chests of jewels, and part of the land holdings were also included in the dowry. Altogether, this amounted to a sum comparable to 2 annual budgets of Arnaud, which made the deal extremely profitable. A dowry is the property and money that a bride brings to her husband's house upon marriage, a kind of family contribution to her future. The amount is often so large that it's impossible to remember in detail, so Bianca was genuinely surprised that Zachary listed it all so easily. Sometimes it is important to remember exact amounts. For example, in a divorce, when the husband is obliged to return the dowry to the bride's family, or part of it. That's why Bianca couldn't help but wonder if the rumors were true. Zachary really could have another woman. Ms. Arnaud expressed her suspicions directly, adding that she would not interfere with his relationship if he really did have a mistress. However, at that moment, the beauty noticed a strange expression on the young man's face. He was looking at her with obvious irritation. Although in theory, he should have felt embarrassed, because any husband would be awkward if his wife talked about his possible mistress. The man sighed loudly and declared that he could not imagine who could tell Lady Arnaud such nonsense. He then calmly explained that they would discuss the issue of an heir later, when the time was right, but that now it was completely pointless. The The lady was completely confused by the man's cold attitude towards the issue of the child, but Zachary did not let her finish and decided that it was time for the miss to return to her chambers. Since the young man knew that Vincent was standing on the other side of the door, the count asked the butler to escort the lady back to her room. As a result, the young countess was literally forced to leave Zachary's bedroom and proceed into the corridor. When Miss was led out, the room was finally silent, and only the forgotten silver fox fur coat remained lying on the floor. The man was now in a state of intense irritation. He involuntarily recalled a recent tragic incident, the death of a nanny from an infectious disease. The nurse who came with Milady from Blanchefort was the only one to whom the lady could truly trust and open up. She then almost stopped eating, cried constantly day and night, unable to find peace from grief. In those days, the lady did not want to see anyone and asked them to stay away from her. She even asked her husband to remove his armor before approaching after a battle, because she could not stand the smell of blood. When the lady first came to Arno, she cried even when their glances accidentally met. Since returning from the battlefield, Bianca had avoided the count, claiming he smelled of blood, but today she grabbed him herself as if nothing had happened. Although the young man was sure that he could still smell bad, since he really hadn't had time to take a bath after the journey, the changes in the girl's character were hard to miss, and this confused him more and more. However, he was still unable to understand what exactly had changed during the time he had been away. Meanwhile, Vincent had already escorted Lady Bianca back to her room, observing all formalities. While the girl was under supervision, she thought only about her past life together with the count. Their first night took place when she was 20 years old. After this, the couple shared a bed only in rare moments before his departure for war, and ultimately, they were unable to have an heir. And then, when Bianca was 25, the count went off to war again and never returned. 7 years later, he died on the battlefield. Now Bianca knew she had to have a child as soon as possible to avoid repeating the tragedy of the past. Now, the reborn girl was ready to do anything for the sake of the heir, even if she had to take the first step herself. When the butler escorted her to the bedroom, he offered to escort the lady straight to the bed. However, Bianca was not in the mood, so she sharply told the butler not to follow her any further and allowed herself to go alone. As the enraged lady headed in the right direction of the palace, Vincent noticed that the lady had lost her fox fur. Bianca returned to her room and, looking out the window, continued to ponder the best possible outcome for herself, understanding the inevitability of her goal. She clearly understood that to become pregnant, she needed to sleep with the count. But it was obvious that Zachary himself was unlikely to be inclined to do this, and even if Bianca made the first move, he might simply reject her. The girl had almost forgotten how tall and intimidating this man was, and whether he had always been so strong and muscular. However, before she had only seen him in the dark, and how could she know his true appearance and details of his appearance? However, now the lady was thinking that with her not yet fully developed body, it would be difficult to seduce a man, and it was unlikely that this would change much in the future. There had been no tenderness from Zachary in the past, only coldness and cruelty, and perhaps even if Bianca had been a man, he would not have been impressed. Now, Lady Arno could only guess who the count's favorite really was. Perhaps his chosen one had even risen to the serf or aristocratic circles. Moreover, Bianca couldn't help but notice that the prince remembered the entire dowry perfectly well. It seemed the aristocrat would be prepared to return it to Bianca's hometown if he decided to make his mistress the next Countess of Arno. If you think about it, it doesn't really matter who exactly the count loves, but having a child from a man whose heart belongs to another seemed like an unbearably difficult test to her. Just the thought of it raised an unpleasant, almost unbearable feeling of disgust inside me. While the lady was pondering the cruelty of the whole situation, someone quietly came up from behind and threw her fox fur coat over her. When the main character of this story turned around, she saw her husband in front of her, who carefully returned the lost thing to her. In addition, the young man even complimented the girl, noting that the fur coat really looked very good on Bianca. Zachary de Arno also took the opportunity at that moment to thank her for something she had said earlier. After that, without further explanation, he turned around and headed back towards his room. The lady did not immediately understand what exactly the young man thanked his wife for, remaining slightly perplexed. It was also strange that he suddenly started talking about fur, as if hinting at her recent spending or habits. This had happened before, when the girl was begging for another expensive fur coat. Then, her nanny was surprised to see a real squirrel skin in her hands. It was natural for Miss Arno to spare no expense on quality fur, as in her hometown, she always wore only the finest and warmest items. That's why the young lady's personal maid last time condemned Count Zachary's choice. How could a husband bring his wife squirrel fur if even mink fur would not be enough for Bianca? The woman believed that Bianca's father had acted unwisely when choosing a groom for his daughter. She absolutely did not want the little miss to marry a second son and tie herself to such a pathetic family. The nanny wanted a different fate for Bianca, for her to become not a countess, but a duchess. However, Zachary himself, like a true knight, only calmly replied that if she needed anything else, the miss could turn to Vincent. The nanny, Madame Jenny, made no secret of her grievances against the count. Among Arno's close associates, she was known as someone capable of causing a scene even in front of him. Over time, the count won many wars and created a rich country capable of satisfying any whim of extravagant ladies. Perhaps Zachary's words about fox fur were just a joke, but the girl had never heard either sarcasm or gratitude from the count before. Even when Jenny complained to him, his face remained indifferent and businesslike. Today, for the first time, the Count showed his wife something resembling attention or concern. Now the lady decided for herself. If she crossed paths with Zachary more often and talked to him, his thoughts about the heir might change. And then Bianca would definitely be able to achieve her goal. So the young master should be prepared for her determination. The next day, the Arno castle was in turmoil due to an unprecedented incident. While the servants were working, they could not stop discussing the fact that the lady was actually looking for the Count herself. The servants whispered that Bianca had personally come down to meet her husband and then immediately went with him to his office. No one expected such behavior from the lady, which is why this news caused such a stir in the whole house. And although many of the maids realized that it was unlikely that anything had happened between the young people, they still found it incredibly interesting to gossip about the mistress and the Count. Some maids even found the situation quite pleasant. After all, we must not forget that the lady will soon reach adulthood, and it is quite possible that she will soon become pregnant. Even if this did not happen, their relationship might at least improve, so the naive maids were sure that the mistress now looked at the Count differently. Only one persistent girl was completely in disagreement with the changes in Bianca's behavior. The unpleasant maid pointed out that even if Bianca had a different opinion, it would not change anything. It was the Count who had to receive this cold woman. A maid named Ante had always disliked the Countess. She considered her mistress a cold and gloomy woman who did only what she pleased, while the servants fussed around her like fools. Ante was simply jealous of the Countess and believed that she herself would have coped with the role of the Count's wife much better. The other maids tried to calm their colleague, but her irritation was already difficult to contain, despite the fact that her words were rude towards both the Count and the mistress. The impudent maid was sure that her mistress's skin was as cold as her heart, like a snake's or a frog's, and continued to shower her with insults. Ante was so carried away that she didn't even notice how Bianca herself approached her from behind. Miss Arno was not going to tolerate such humiliating treatment, and as soon as she approached, she sharply waved her hand towards her face. A second later, the Countess's slap landed right on Ante's cheek. Let's go back a little. During the day, Bianca, as if nothing had happened, went about her business. At that moment, another aristocrat approached the young lady. The guest asked the Countess whether the girl had informed Zachary that she was ready to accept this acquaintance and her child, since now this lady would also live in the Arno castle. Now, Bianca didn't understand at all what was happening. Could this girl really be Zachary's lover? In response, the beauty, in a calm, almost icy tone, continued to tell Bianca not to worry. Now it was she, together with Zachary, who would take care of the continuation of the Arno line. And Bianca herself can simply lock herself in her room and never come out again. And the Count himself, allegedly, also confirmed that he and the young lady would take care of the heir of the family. The Count also added that if Miss needed anything, she could, as before, turn to Vincent. Sunlight fell directly on Bianca's face, and she woke up abruptly. It was just a nightmare. The dream was so realistic that she broke out in a cold sweat. Had the Count's one-time exclusion from a conversation or coldly dismissal really traumatized her so much? Still, the Count rarely shows emotions, but this does not mean that he cannot have a mistress. Whatever Bianca's worries, the main thing now is to cross paths with Zachary more often, and then talk to him about the heir or act more decisively. Asking for a child directly seemed shameful, but what else could Countess Arno do? She saw no other options. When the lady left the room, she accidentally overheard a conversation between two maids. This was that very disgusting monologue of Ante about the true nature of the mistress. The maid got so carried away that she couldn't stop herself, continuing to throw mud at her mistress, Arno. It was extremely unpleasant to listen to all these vile statements. Particularly unbearable were the words that Ante considered herself a much more worthy candidate for the role of the master's wife. A dark and vicious woman, a woman who brings slander on the family's reputation. Bianca had heard such expressions before, but over time, she had learned to ignore them. However, now the main character of this story was not going to leave this unanswered. The Countess swung sharply at the impudent maid. After the blow, Bianca coldly reminded her of all the unpleasant words that had just come out of her mouth. The offended maid stood in complete shock. She had nothing to say in her defense. Bianca taught the girl such a lesson with her words, and then her actions, that Ante looked at her mistress in horror, not believing what was happening. However, Bianca wasn't going to stop at just a slap. She turned to another maid and asked for a rod. Today, the Countess's mood was worse than ever, and she will have to answer in full for this. Besides, what did this assistant even expect? She wouldn't have gotten away with it. One could simply laugh. But how could this impudent maid even dare compare herself to her mistress? When the rods were in the Countess's hands, Bianca asked Ante to stretch out her arms. The first blow to the palms was a punishment for the girl daring to compare herself to the noble lady. The second blow was dealt because the girl dared to listen to other people's gossip about her mistress, and because Ante does not know how to keep her mouth shut. By the fourth blow, more people had gathered around. This blow turned out to be the most powerful, as it was inflicted for slander and insults against the lady. However, after numerous blows, the Countess seemed to have no intention of stopping. She had given in to her emotions too much. But at this rate, the girl could really beat the maid to serious consequences, so the lady had to be stopped. Army Commander Robert intervened and grabbed her hand. Naturally, Lady Arno did not like this. Besides, she did not immediately understand who was standing in front of her. Absolutely everyone knew about Zachary de Arno's 3 honorary commanders. Of them, only Robert had served before Lady Bianca's arrival and enjoyed an impeccable reputation. No matter how indifferent the lady was to court affairs, it was strange not to know the name of one of the main knights. However, Robert did not argue with the miss and calmly introduced himself. Bianca then explained that she was merely disciplining the maid and asked her to let go of her hand. However, Robert objected that she had gone too far. The Countess d'Arnaud is certainly his mistress, but he cannot silently watch such mockery. Auntie, trying to play the victim, actually felt little remorse. She didn't even fully understand what had happened, believing she had simply told the truth. Bianca could admit that she did have a fiery and difficult character, but she was not going to simply swallow such insults. After all, today, the lady heard direct humiliation directed at her. There was no need to say that Bianca was a terrible and cold wife, and that some maid named Ante could easily replace the Count and sleep with her husband. Just at this moment, Count Zachary d'Arnaud himself approached the scene of the conflict. How inopportunely he appeared, precisely at the most tense and unpleasant moment. But Auntie was beside herself with hope. She believed that the Count would definitely take her side. Everyone knew the master to be magnanimous. He once even forgave a wheat thief who begged for mercy and promised to repay the debt on his word of honor, even though the law stipulated a severe punishment for such a thief. Because of this unexpected gentleness on the part of Mr. Bianca, was almost certain that Auntie might be the woman he was hiding from her. The first thing the Count did was ask his wife if her hand was okay. Indeed, Bianca was so carried away by punishing the maid that she did not notice how she injured her hand during the blow with the rods. Then the master ordered a doctor to be called to treat his wife's wound. However, Bianca intervened in the conversation and coldly stated that she did not need this. It would be better for the doctor to take care of the girl whom the gentleman was so obviously protecting. After this, she asked him directly whether this maid was his mistress. Bianca explained that she had punished Ante as a warning to the other servants and admitted that she had gone a little too far, but added that she could stop now, since this servant, in her opinion, was quite capable of taking her place in her master's bed. At that moment, Bianca was so angry that she silently threw the rods at Robert and quickly walked to her room, not wanting to listen to anyone. She didn't even want to take care of her own hand, considering it unnecessary, as if anyone would even care that she punished the maid. In response, the lady coldly advised to cure only the maid's pretty face, after which she left with her head held high. It was time for Count d'Arnaud himself to find out from the maid what had really happened. Ante began to justify herself, claiming that she was only diligently washing the floor. However, the Count understood perfectly well that if the girl had simply been cleaning, his wife would not have become so furious. Besides, Zachary needed to find out why Bianca decided that an ordinary maid was his lover. The master also ordered Vincent to do everything possible to prevent rumors from spreading throughout the castle. After this, the cold Count d'Arnaud decided to leave the estate. As soon as the master left, Vincent ordered the impudent maid sent home. Servants are best when they know how to keep quiet, and Auntie clearly didn't possess that quality. Therefore, this maid was no longer fit to work in the castle. It was time for her to return home. The girl tried to beg the head butler for forgiveness, but Vincent remained adamant. Then Vincent asked Robert what the young man was doing in the castle. The knight recounted how he saw the Countess slapping her maid's hands and tried to stop her. However, upon learning the insults uttered toward his mistress, he realized her anger was not without foundation. Nevertheless, Robert was still surprised that the young Countess decided to punish the maid personally. That miss, who previously seemed uninterested in the life of the castle and hardly left her chambers, suddenly showed such a sharp reaction. Before that, she had only silently lived her life and done shopping. Vincent also noted that the lady's actions today were not inconsistent with her character, even if they had been rather cruel. The butler then added that he was now almost certain that the lady's attitude toward the Arnold household had begun to change. Meanwhile, the lady herself lay on the bed. How tired she was that day, and how her arms ached. The palms were swollen, and that maid's hands seemed to be like 2 loaves of bread. But for some reason, this thought even made her feel a little better. Countess Bianca lay there and still couldn't get the thought out of her head that the Count must be comforting that girl right now. Milady imagined how he might carefully take her swollen hands, quietly whisper something soothing, and at some point even take away her place as countess. The lady opened her heart only to her nanny Jenny, who came with her from Blanchefort. After her death 5 years ago, there was not a single truly close servant left nearby. The young mistress was left almost alone in the Arnaud castle. However, there was one girl, an ordinary maid, who only swept and cleaned the floors near the mistress's chambers. This servant could only watch from afar, as she who was used to dealing with pain and loneliness alone. And yet now the young lady could not simply stand aside silently, so the girl decided to help the countess. She knocked on the door and explained that she had come to treat Bianca's wounds with an herbal infusion to reduce the swelling and fever in her hands. It was just a folk remedy, but any help would be welcome right now. The kind maid said that since Bianca did not want to call a doctor, she could at least help her this way. The girl asked the countess to trust her just once. She would make a compress and immediately leave. Bianca decided to agree. It couldn't make things any worse anyway. At that moment, the main character of this story felt a slight warmth. A pleasant feeling inside transported her to memories of the time when her beloved nanny helped young Bianca heal from yet another injury. The nanny then consoled the little girl, gently suggesting to her that she was too good for this world, and therefore no one really understood her. Now, a grown-up Bianca sat there, grateful for even such simple help from the maid. She even decided to ask her assistant's name again. The girl's name was Yvonne. The countess noted that the decoction really helped a little and asked Yvonne to make the same healing compress tomorrow as well. Yvonne felt that the lady was afraid of refusal, but she still extended her hands and calmly accepted the request. That day, the simple assistant was happy that she could finally do something useful for her mistress, and she happily agreed. Only after the treatment was over did Bianca begin to wonder again about what to do next. She was beginning to think the Count didn't want children with her because he already had another woman. And without children, the Count's wife's situation in Arno's house seemed almost hopeless. Too many questions arose in her mind. What should she do? How could she survive? And there was no answer to any of them. Bianca was distracted from her heavy thoughts by her assistant's quiet admiration. It turned out that Yvonne noticed something on the floor and couldn't contain her interest. A beautiful piece of lace appeared in her hands, and Yvonne sincerely admired it, comparing the pattern to butterfly wings. She had never seen such fine and elegant embroidery before. At that moment, Bianca's mood lifted a little. She remembered one important point. The reincarnated girl has a weapon that can become her strength. 10 years ago in the capital of Sevran, Louise, the son of Viscount Vigue, was caught up with by the Emperor, who asked for a conversation. At that time, Zachary had the status of the main knight in the Arno estate. The stranger, who wanted to speak with the knight, introduced himself as Gustave de Blanchefort, a name already known to the young gentleman. Gustave de Blanchefort is the right hand of His Highness the Crown Prince Gautier, and a loyal subject of Sevran. As soon as Zachary heard this significant name, he bowed apologetically to his new acquaintance, trying not to be perceived as rude or ignorant. However, this was unnecessary. Gustave himself had taken the initiative in the conversation. The man asked Zachary to spare him a little time, as he had long wanted to discuss something important with him. They went into the garden to quietly sip tea and discuss business. The drink contained herbs grown right in the royal garden. It was rumored that in foreign countries, it was now becoming fashionable to drink various herbal infusions. The older man's demeanor made it clear that he was genuinely glad to have the opportunity to share a cup of tea with the brave knight. However, it was soon time to move on to the purpose of his personal visit. The man began by saying that from today on, he believed in the prince with all his heart. The Duke had no doubt that His Highness would one day become the rightful ruler of Sevran. Even though there were political forces supporting the second prince, Jacob, there weren't many of them, but it was still not worth relaxing. That day, Gustave offered the knight a rather unexpected, but very profitable offer. The man asked if Zachary would like to become the sword of His Highness the First Prince. Zachary thanked him for the trust shown, but calmly explained that he had only recently received the title of Baron and was not sure whether a man like him, without much fame, had the right to become Prince Gautier's protector. Although in reality, Zachary always downplayed his own achievements, he was a rather modest person. In fact, Zachary de Arnaud was known as the Black Wolf of Sevran, a man who had been preparing for battle since the age of 16 and had long since earned his reputation. Blanchefort always remained on the side of His Highness Prince Gautier, and Gustave would not have offered such an honor to a random person. He stated directly that he wanted to see Zachary by his side in the service of the future king. The man did not even hide his confidence that the bright future of the kingdom largely depended on Monsieur de Arnaud. If he had to swear allegiance to someone who was supported by the future king himself, Zachary simply could not refuse. He gratefully accepted the offer and promised his continued loyalty and support to His Excellency. However, Gustave had one more small request for the knight. The conversation was about marriage. For a moment, Zachary was so tense that he even thought Gustave was about to propose marriage. But of course, it was about his beautiful unmarried daughter. Gustave pointed out that if his interlocutor married the daughter, he would become not only an ally, but also a full-fledged member of the Blanchefort family. And after marriage, he'll be able to personally support Zachary with his connections and wealth. Now, the man was completely confident that this marriage was beneficial for all parties and hoped that Zachary would not miss this opportunity. A profitable marriage in the country of Sevran was considered an extremely tempting offer. It was difficult to refuse Count Blanchefort's offer, especially for someone who had once been kicked out of the Vigue family with practically nothing. Through this marriage, he could gain both fame and noble birth. In a sense, it could be compared to a profitable business deal. And of course, the dowry looked quite impressive. It was then that Vincent, having read the agreement, noted that in the event of marriage, Zachary would receive good livestock, a significant amount of silverware, expensive fabrics, 2 chests of jewelry, and a portion of land equal to Arno's budget for 2 years. Vincent, after examining the documents, first noted that it would be difficult for Arno to properly manage such a rich dowry. However, Zachary told the butler that they would have to try. The gentleman also asked Vincent to send a letter to where reinforcements had been requested last month and to find out how much they were willing to pay for Arno to send his troops. If we look at marriage as a business, then the Count, in essence, sold himself to Blanchefort as a warhorse. As for his future wife, Bianca, her image gave the Count much to think about. It was the image of a woman who had never worked in her life, with hands ruined by the rod. Soon, when the Count sent Ante away, he hastily called together the 3 commanders. The knightly guard commanders had already become frightened, not understanding why there was such an urgent rush. Robert couldn't figure out what was happening. The young people had returned only yesterday. Was it really war again? All that was left was to speculate and wait for an explanation from the captain. However, the guys were ready for anything, so they confidently entered their master's office. The first thing they asked was what had happened and why His Excellency had gathered all 3 of the strongest knights. Robert even suggested that Aragon had begun the offensive again, and it was time to return to the battlefield. But then Zachary calmly noted that there was a much more important question at the moment. This answer puzzled the knights even more. What could be more important than war? While the others were trying to comprehend the situation, Sovar noticed that the Count was wearing glasses for the first time, although he had never worn them before. Then Zachary said in a stern tone that he wanted the boys to guard his wife, and not just any one of them, but one of the three of them. This statement shocked the knights. They could not understand how this could be more important than military affairs. Sovar wondered out loud why his wife, who hardly ever leaves her room, needed security. However, Robert suggested that it might be related to today's incident, and that something similar could very well happen again. Zachary was convinced, judging by the knight's words. Bianca spent most of her time in her chambers. But since this had happened, as soon as Miss Arno had left, it was still unknown what might happen next. Therefore, the gentleman wanted his wife to have the most trusted person by his side from now on, monitoring her safety. Zachary wanted maximum protection for Bianca and those around her, because she was truly dear to him. That same night, the Lord and his knights chose the main candidate for bodyguard for the Count's wife. The next morning, Yvonne came into Bianca's room to carry out more treatment procedures. The girl was still asleep, so the assistant decided not to wake her mistress, and carefully took her hand out from under the blanket to assess the consequences of yesterday's punishment. Her hands were still very swollen. If Bianca had let Yvonne help earlier, everything would have healed faster. However, now it was necessary to use folk methods, which were better than no treatment at all. Yvonne did not consider herself equal to her mistress, but she had a younger sister about the same age as Bianca. The assistant's sister, Lucy, married a carpenter who was much older than her, so they rarely saw each other. Every time she thought about the lonely lady within the walls of the huge castle, Yvonne remembered her sister. While she was treating her mistress's hand, Bianca accidentally woke up. But it was already time to get up, so she didn't get angry at her assistant. Then Bianca even asked the maid to help her change. The choice of outfit indicated that the lady was planning to leave her room today. The girl had a lot of things planned. When she had changed and gone out with her maid, Bianca realized that she had made a mistake in not wearing a warm fur coat. The weather was still chilly. Yvonne noticed that the lady was freezing and decided to return to Bianca's room to bring her a fur coat. This little detail was very pleasing to the lady. The assistant turned out to be not only smart, but also truly caring. If these girls had met in a past life and gotten to know each other earlier, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. But there was no point in thinking about the past. Now it was necessary to build the future. There was no point in wasting time thinking about what might have changed if fate had turned out differently. The lady had too little time to waste on regrets. From early morning, Bianca headed to the office of the estate's head butler. Today, she began the conversation by mentioning that Vincent had previously handled the finances of the Arnaud household long before her marriage to the Count. Now it was assumed that the Countess should do this, although previously, she could not take on such a responsibility due to her young age. Now the lady had grown up. She was 18, and she was quite capable of managing the expenses of the Arnaud household. Besides, Bianca was sure that no one could teach her how to run a household better than Vincent himself, so she asked him to become her mentor. The butler considered her offer for a moment, and, come to think of it, Bianca had truly changed noticeably after purchasing the white fox fur coat. Vincent noted that this had never happened before after purchasing luxury items. She had always spent huge sums on extremely expensive items, but now her spending had noticeably decreased. Moreover, the butler hadn't forgotten the previous day's incident with the maid, who had overindulged. Although the punishment might have seemed excessive, it was an attempt to establish discipline, rather than remain a bystander, as before. An experienced member of staff, Arnaud, noticed that Bianca's desire to manage the family's affairs independently did not seem like a passing whim. Therefore, Vincent happily agreed to become Madame Arnaud's mentor. He offered to learn everything by doing and to walk around the grounds right now to explain everything in detail to the young lady. Bianca was glad everything had gone smoothly. She didn't want to dwell on the past again, so she decided to focus on the present. Housekeeping was a new step for her, something she had not done in her previous life. To do things right, it was necessary to find the right people, and with their help, develop the House of Arnaud. Then the Count will understand that Bianca is no longer a helpless child, but a future political partner. That day, the butler also recalled the issue that Zachary had raised earlier. The man was supposed to discuss the organization of her security. 3 knights appeared before Lady Arnaud. From this day on, one of them would accompany her constantly. First, the butler introduced Commander Robert, whom Bianca already knew. He then named Commander Gaspar, describing him as a slightly withdrawn person. The butler also introduced the lady to Commander Sovar, a more freedom-loving man who had previously been freed from serfdom. Now, the lady had to personally choose her bodyguard from among the 3 knights of the guard. As she watched them, Miss noticed that the Count's loyal commanders were clearly not eager to take on this task, and that was why she began to doubt the very idea. The girl also noted that Vincent is always nearby, so she does not need an extra entourage and constant accompaniment. However, the butler quickly made it clear that this was not up for discussion. Such were the master's orders. On hearing of the order, the lady could only assume that she was now becoming part of a political game under a man with absolute power, and this decision seemed too hasty to her. Even in the matter of choosing an escort, Zachary did not ask, but directly ordered that someone from his trusted persons be chosen. The escort seemed more like a means of control, and that's why the girl felt anxious. Zachary watched this whole scene from the window, closely following his wife's doubts. One might assume that the lady felt humiliated. The order for protection could too easily be perceived as covert surveillance. because whatever the Countess does, he will know about it. Can we then say that the Count and Countess are truly equal as spouses? However, it's only fair that a girl should ask her husband's permission, and the situation itself didn't require excessive drama. It was necessary to think positively, so Bianca began considering bodyguard candidates. Let's start with Robert. Yesterday he listened to the Countess, and even tried to stop her. If you choose him, you'll have to endure constant nagging from his side. Gaspar. His size was intimidating. He probably wouldn't talk. He's taciturn by nature, but such oppressive silence could also be oppressive. Sovor. Former commoner. That doesn't sound very respectable anymore. Besides, this knight looked like he would make mistakes often, and that was clearly not the best option. Bianca was already living her second life, but she was faced with such a pressing choice for the first time. All three had flaws. It was necessary to choose one. But before she could put a final point to her thoughts, Yvonne quietly approached her and threw a warm fur coat over her shoulders. It turned out that she was there at this difficult moment. The assistant admitted that she did not know where her mistress was, so she first went to the butler's room and wasted time, but still managed to find her. The boys also noticed the maid, who apparently was very close to the mistress. Yvonne's appearance instantly relieved the tension, but the question of choosing a bodyguard still remained. Luckily, one of the knights decided to make the first move. Gaspar raised his hand, and in a quiet but confident voice, declared that he would be Bianca's guard. At that moment, the girl noticed that his physique was almost as imposing as the Count's, and his face was expressionless. In this too, he resembled Zachary. Even now, he stood before her, offering himself as her escort. At least Bianca was glad that she wouldn't have to endure any unnecessary noise, so she decided to appoint Sir Gaspard as her bodyguard. The decision was finally made. From that day on, Sir Gaspard would be her companion. After this, the girl immediately pointed out to Vincent that they had already lost too much time, so it was worth starting the inspection with the living quarters. However, before they could begin their first tour of the castle, Bianca's husband decided to meet her in person. Zachary gave the miss his full attention with just one look, and then asked if he could touch her face. After which, he carefully touched Miss Arno's tender cheek with his palm. This gesture looked reverent and calm. As it turned out, the gentleman was checking to see if she had a fever. The maid also noticed that her mistress's skin was hot. It wasn't hard to guess that this was due to her having been outside for so long, without a warm coat. Meanwhile, Robert, looking around, noticed that the gentleman's office was located directly above the place where the young people were now standing, and it became clear that he had been watching what was happening all this time. Zachary then pointed out that it would be better for his wife to return to her room today. He also explained that he needed to speak with Bianca, so he would take her there himself, and the knights could return to their duties. Everyone in the castle was pleasantly surprised that the Count was personally accompanying his wife. Mr. Arno took the girl by the hand and calmly led her to his chambers. As they walked, Bianca thought about how obvious it was what the conversation would be about. It would probably be about yesterday's incident. Bianca was sure the young man would make her apologize to that girl. She felt that if Zachary was really going to bring that girl as a second wife, they simply had to learn to get along. The young lady was so sure of her husband's infidelity that she no longer considered other options of what he might want to talk about. However, there was no point in guessing, and the girl decided to ask him directly why she had been called to accompany him today if she had not had a fever. She also added that if he wants her to apologize to the maid, he will not be able to achieve this. She has pride. And although Bianca was not sure whether the girl was in love with the Count, she was now the Countess of the Arno estate. However, to her surprise, the young man calmly announced that he had already fired that maid. Bianca was so overcome with jealousy and anxiety that at first she thought he might have done it just to clear himself of suspicion. But Zachary made it clear that he did not have any mistress. Bianca still didn't quite believe him. She thought he was just trying to avoid the conversation. In response to her emotions, he silently touched her cheek with his palm again. Then Zachary said sincerely that he was not the type of person to have affairs behind his wife's back. Whether it was the temperature or the fact that he was so close to her, Bianca could clearly hear his heartbeat. She could smell him, and, standing next to him, she gradually lost her composure. These familiar aromas emanated from the hands of Count Zachary de Arno. Milady smelled the same scent she had smelled in her past life. And this scent literally took Bianca back to the past, to the times when she was closer to Mr. Zachary than anyone else. The sweet scent of Armani musk stirred her thoughts, but now was not the time to get lost in memories. Only after the young man's explanation did Bianca finally realize that the girl was not her husband's mistress. Then the conversation turned to the fact that if they had or were planning to have a child, then such doubts would not have arisen. Moreover, in the era in which Bianca lived, by the age of 18, many people already had children. Summing up what had been said, Zachary calmly noted that it did not matter to him whether Bianca believed that he did not have a mistress, and added that it was still too early for the heir. Then the girl remarked that if he didn't want a child now, then why did he assign her an escort and force her to choose among knights who would find it difficult to be around all the time? However, he explained that this was necessary to avoid situations like yesterday's, and that one maid was not capable of providing such protection. After all, who could better ensure safety? A trained knight or a servant? The answer was obvious. But Bianca still objected, saying that she was just walking around his castle and nothing should happen to her. At that moment, Zachary gently corrected her, saying that the castle did not belong to him alone, but to both of them. For Bianca, this sounded unexpected and surprisingly warm. In his past life, He had never said such words. However, noticing that her temperature was rising again, he suggested ending the argument, not allowing the girl to continue arguing and disrupt her own plans for the day. If this conversation was for the sake of bickering, then what did the man really want to talk about? These questions that tormented the lady were never voiced. She was forced to go to her room and fall asleep, but that night, the lady found it impossible to sleep at all. Despite rest, the lady's temperature continued to rise, which is why she barely got out of bed for several days. She didn't understand what could have caused her to get sick, and her thoughts kept returning to how it all started. That evening, Zachary discussed the fact that Gaspar had volunteered to be Bianca's escort. His lordship asked Robert and Sauveur to divide the duties of the third night between themselves. In the end, they decided that Sauveur would be responsible for the work in the stables, and Robert would handle logistics. Meanwhile, Vincent had already brought freshly brewed mulled wine. He hadn't made it like that for a long time. Then the man remembered how the mistress had suddenly asked him to teach her how to run the house that day. It seemed to him that her intentions were as unpredictable as drops of water on lotus leaves. You never know where they'll fall. Previously, the girl sat in her room all day and hardly went anywhere. But in the last few days, she has started to appear more often and change a lot around her. Incidentally, Vincent decided to ask Zachary what the husband and wife had discussed the previous day. The knight was also curious about the conversation, which had proven so important that even the maids had been removed. He wanted the count to tell himself how the girl thought he had a mistress on the side. Zachary suggested that Bianca might have been worried about being sent back to her home. At that moment, Robert remembered her threats to the maid, that he shouldn't spread rumors about her being a cold wife, and that she was allegedly capable of having an affair with someone else's husband. It was obvious that the young lady was really angry with the simple maid. Just in case, Zachary then asked if Bianca had sent letters to Blanchefort. The butler replied that she had neither written nor received a single letter. Moreover, Count Blanchefort himself, apparently, did not deign to write her even a couple of lines. Considering his reaction to the death of his nanny Bianca from an infectious disease 5 years ago, this was not surprising. That day, Zachary turned to Bianca's father to tell him how hard it was for his daughter, since the woman who had become her mother had passed away. However, all the Count replied was that if this disease had affected Arno, it would have affected the whole of Sevran. Later, the man only ordered that formal condolences be conveyed to His Highness the First Prince. Remembering these words of Bianca's father, it was not difficult to understand that he did not particularly care about his daughter. At the same time, Zachary asked Vincent to make sure that the butler would not have any trouble teaching Bianca everything she wanted. Besides this, the Count wanted Vincent to inform him about everything that particularly interested the girl. His lordship ordered the process to be organized so that Bianca would learn to run the household herself and get used to it by spring, since he planned to take her with him to the capital of Laos. After such words, it became obvious that the escort for Miss was for a long time. Any experienced knight in the office could easily imagine what the path to Laos would be like. However, no one present could understand why the Count suddenly decided to take his wife with him. If you think about it, Bianca could easily buy up half the stores in the capital if she wanted. By the age of 18, noble families often had 2 or 3 children, and wasn't that the wife's role? To wait for her husband and manage the household? However, the main problem remained that the young couple still lacked an heir, something Sauveur pondered. Not having fully sorted out his own thoughts, the boy awkwardly voiced his guess to the gentleman. He suggested out loud that the reason a man wanted to take his wife to the capital with him might be because he planned to have an heir. Such a direct question made the seemingly stern Count slightly embarrassed. He involuntarily recalled his wife's words that she would like a child from him. Zachary did not answer such provocative questions, only briefly explaining that he did not want to touch on this topic, since that was not the issue at hand. Meanwhile, Robert began to guess what his master really wanted to talk about with the Countess. In the spring, he was going to take her with him to the capital. However, the knights were mistaken. The Count believed there was no point in telling her about the trip in advance, since they weren't leaving yet, and besides, the lady might refuse. What surprised the knights most was that he took Bianca's consent for granted. The Countess, having gradually recovered, actually began to learn how to run a household and gradually came to her senses. This time she dressed warmer, throwing on a thick fur coat, and was ready for new tasks. It was colder than usual today, so she had to wrap up warm. She really didn't want to catch a cold again. The aristocrats set out. Along the way, Vincent explained that most of Arno's territory was flat land, and the hill on which the castle stood was one of the highest points. It turned out that there was a forest higher up the slopes, and a river flowed next to it, so both agriculture and forestry could be developed on these lands. Vincent was sincerely pleased with this fact. In his past life, Vincent told the Countess, who had never been particularly interested in Arno's affairs, about this only once. And even then, the spoiled wife of the young master hardly listened to such stories about her own possessions. All this happened before the news of the Count's death in the war became known, during the same period when Viscount Vigue, the deceased's brother, expelled the lady from Arno. Even in such a dire situation, Vincent tried to help the poor orphan. When Bianca was driven out, he explained that if Miss Bianca went straight east, she would reach the forest, and then, following the forest path for about 10 days, she could reach the Blanchefort family lands. As the girl walked barefoot for days and nights, she thought about how level this land seemed to her, despite all the difficulties of the path. As she wandered, her soul gradually filled with hatred for this place. And now, when the heroine has decided to survive at all costs, She looks into the distance and is amazed at how beautiful these lands are. After examining the surroundings and explaining the situation of the territories, Vincent stopped at the sewing shop. He remembered that the lady had asked about this place earlier. He also told us everything about the production of embroidery for clothing and banners. At this point, passers-by immediately recognized the Countess. As soon as they saw the young lady, whispers and discussions began about the recent rumors about how the girl had beaten and fired Ante. These rumors were so unpleasant that even Bianca's maid felt embarrassed and ashamed at how quickly such rumors spread among people. However, Countess Arno herself decided not to dwell on the stranger's words and turned her attention to the embroidery. She inquired who had created the piece and how long it had taken to complete. Then the girl standing nearby admitted that it was she who had embroidered this pattern and that it had taken her about 4 days of painstaking work to create it. In response, Bianca asked her to find the Countess the next day, after which she calmly turned around, getting ready to continue her business. As an experienced seamstress, Bianca immediately noticed the girl's talent. The accuracy of her stitches and the speed of her work indicated that she could easily be taught more. Vincent then announced that their next stop would be a local shop and candle workshop, where they would head next. At first, the aristocrats went into a butcher's shop, but it was noticeable that the heroine did not show much interest in meat and its trade. Vincent continued to talk about the cattle from which meat and fat are obtained, explaining the intricacies of the farm, but this did not particularly interest the girl. Bianca was so uninterested that she hurried the butler and asked him to quickly go to the candle shop. Luckily, the right place was nearby, so they didn't have to walk long. She had heard before that candles could be considered almost a luxury item, as they were difficult to produce and distribute. Now she wanted to see it with her own eyes and remember the process. When they entered the workshop, an experienced candlemaker explained that the products were made from pork fat. He repeatedly dipped the wick into the molten mass, and each time the candle became thicker. The master even suggested that Bianca try to repeat the candle-making process, and then the lady noticed that this product was different from those in her room. The candles in the Count and Countess's private chambers, as well as in the dining rooms, were made of the highest quality beeswax. This material is obtained only in the spring, when bees produce honey, making it rare and expensive. These types of candles are mainly used for royal and religious ceremonies, as they have almost no scent and leave significantly less soot. The Count ordered that beeswax candles be placed wherever Bianca was, so it is not surprising that the girl did not even know what pork fat smelled like. At such moments, Bianca felt spoiled, because everything Vincent said meant that it was for her that they were buying such expensive things. Although it was the Count's order, the words about her special position slightly offended the girl, so she decided to quickly end the visit and return home. So, the goal for today was accomplished, and it was time to return to the castle. However, before leaving the shop, the girl accidentally heard a noise coming from a box standing nearby. Gaspar lifted the lid of the box, and then everyone saw a little boy inside, who was quietly hiding. When Gaspar pulled the child out by the scruff of the neck, it turned out that he was holding a small knife in his hands. At that moment, Bianca thought for a second that someone might have sent the child with bad intentions. However, the master hastened to explain that it was his colleague's son, who was simply hiding and playing with a knife. Taking a closer look at the object, Bianca realized that it would be extremely difficult to cause serious harm with such a knife. Therefore, the girl asked Gaspar to carefully put the boy on the floor, especially since the child had already managed to hurt his hand and looked scared. Before leaving the shop for good, Bianca decided to look inside the box from which the noise had come earlier. At that moment, she couldn't believe her eyes. At the bottom of the box lay an incredibly beautiful, handmade candle, distinguished by its delicacy and elegance. All the adults around quickly realized that it was this child who had ruined the candles by cutting them into pieces. However, the boy himself began to deny his guilt, claiming that he was not damaging the product at all, but was trying to save the god. He said that the previous night he had a dream in which God said that he was trapped inside a candle and was suffering, so the child decided to free him by cutting it. Then, Bianca learned that no one had taught the boy to handle the material so carefully, and that this skill had developed on its own. As the master explained, the child's father was a shepherd, and his mother a servant. The boy grew up in a poor family, and would likely have become a cattle breeder like his father, but he had recently developed a strange habit of ruining candles. Then Vincent quietly reminded Lady Arno of an important detail. Even the candles were Arno's property, which meant that the boy's actions could be regarded as damage to property, which was almost tantamount to theft. In such a situation, Bianca should have strictly scolded the child so that he would not repeat such actions again. However, looking at his frightened and naive face, the Countess did not want to apply any punishment to him. Without explaining the reasons, the heroine simply asked the boy to find her the next day. As a result, Bianca spent the entire day learning about housekeeping and gradually becoming immersed in the affairs of the estate. Early the next morning, 2 people, invited by the lady, came to Arno's castle. They were so frightened that it seemed they would have survived punishment more easily than this meeting. The guests were met by Bianca's personal maid to escort them to the Countess and ensure that everything went smoothly. As they walked down the hallway, a boy named Nicola thanked Yvonne for bandaging his wound. He sheepishly explained that he had washed her handkerchief, but it was still wet, so he would definitely return it later. However, the maid gently corrected the child, explaining that it was not her who should be thanked, but the mistress herself, since it was she who had ordered the boy to be helped. Yvonne added that it was Bianca who had ordered him to be taken care of yesterday, and the handkerchief that was used to bandage his hand also belonged to Lady Arno. The lady simply did not have a convenient place to store it, so the item was temporarily kept by the maid. While Yvonne was enthusiastically telling all this, another maid suddenly came out from around the corner and pushed her sharply, causing her to lose her balance and fall to the floor. Looking at her with contempt, the maid called Yvonne a traitor, clearly not hiding her attitude. Ante, who had recently been kicked out, had many friends both inside and outside the castle, and they were not going to remain silent. Rumors that it was the mistress who had fired Ante spread quickly, and soon Yvonne was considered an informer, allegedly revealing other people's secrets. Now the maid was constantly faced with the unkind and disapproving glances of the other maids. Luckily, there were still kind people in this world. When Yvonne fell, the boy immediately offered to help her and tried to lift her up. Moreover, everything was fine with her, because the girl had a strong build and did not receive any serious injuries. Finally, the moment came to meet the lady. When the guests entered Miss Arno's office, Bianca immediately noticed their frightened faces. Next, the girl prepared the necessary documents and strictly informed the seamstress that without Bianca's permission, she had no right to reveal to anyone the design that the lady was going to show her. Bianca promised to teach her guest the technique of weaving such lace. The seamstress was to create as many pieces as she could within a week to demonstrate her skills and progress. Naturally, the guest was genuinely surprised by such an unusual lace pattern, as she had never seen anything like it before, either in terms of complexity or the beauty of its execution. After this, the heroine turned to the little boy and decided to clarify whether Nicola had really taken Arno's candles and cut out various figures from them at his own discretion. However, Bianca had no intention of punishing the child, as Vincent had previously suggested. On the contrary, she handed him a small chest containing rare and very expensive material. As the lady expected, the boy immediately realized what was in front of him. The chest contained first-class beeswax candles, which were especially highly prized. The punishment for the child turned out to be unexpected. He had to cut out as many items from these candles as he could, and then show the result to Bianca herself. Nicola was barely able to recover from his delight. He confessed to the lady that for him, this was not a punishment at all, but a real happiness, and he did not understand why she trusted him with such valuable materials. In reality, it was much simpler. Bianca was essentially investing in the abilities of both of her guests, fully understanding that development requires time, resources, and support. Now, she invested in developing the talents of these people because she was confident that in the future, they would be able to create truly exquisite and sought-after products. The cunning and far-sighted girl then planned to turn this area into her own profitable business based on a unique craft. Lace is a light and elegant handcrafted product made from textile fibers that has already begun to gain popularity in neighboring countries. Over time, lace would become part of haute couture, and it was the Arnaud family that would pioneer its mass production, cementing their leadership in this craft. It was this girl that Bianca decided to teach the art of lace making. In the future, she was to become a true master of her craft. Such was one of Bianca di Arno's main plans. At that time, no one could have imagined that the Arno estate would one day become a center of lace production, famous far beyond its borders. Vincent was given a new, seemingly impossible task. He had to obtain the huge quantity of linen yarn specified in the order, and also regularly provide the boy with beeswax candles. The butler didn't understand the lady's plan at all, so Bianca had to explain that Nicola possessed a rare talent and was capable of creating truly beautiful candlesticks. Lady Arno was so confident in her child's abilities that she trusted him to work with expensive materials without hesitation. Moreover, the girl herself always enjoyed surrounding herself with beautiful and exquisite things. Bianca also assumed that they would need even more resources in the future, so she hoped that Vincent would be able to get everything they needed and provide the craftsmen with enough materials. After this, without even waiting for the butler's answer, the girl decisively ended the conversation and escorted Vincent out of her office. Left alone, the man still couldn't understand his mistress's plan. He only noted that her expenses had begun to rise again and resembled her previous, very significant expenditures. Meanwhile, Yvonne was once again being bullied by the other maids. This time, her clothes were damaged, which was a particularly painful blow for her. The shameless maids threw the girl's only warm garment into the fireplace, and as a result, the clothes burned almost to ashes, leaving her without protection from the cold. Watching Yvonne's tears, the other maids only laughed, because they still considered her a traitor and saw nothing wrong with their cruel behavior. The girls tormented the assistant so much that she could no longer hold back her tears, feeling hurt, lonely, and completely powerless in the face of what was happening. Nevertheless, Yvonne decided not to give up and went to a seamstress she knew, hoping that she could somehow help restore her damaged clothes. However, disappointment awaited her here. The craftswoman was powerless and honestly admitted that it was no longer possible to restore the burnt item. The other maid felt awkward, since last time it was she who brought the rod and reported everything to the butler. Now the girl noticed how Yvonne treated Milady almost like a younger sister, and stayed by her side despite the constant bullying. The attentive seamstress decided to lend Yvonne her coat, realizing how cold she was, but the maid refused because the coat's owner had to work all day in the cold hallway. With a slight smile, trying to hide her pain and awkwardness, Yvonne assured that she was strong enough and the cold was not scary for her, although in fact it was extremely difficult for her. However, even in a light cape, the girl was very cold, and this was immediately noticed by her mistress, who was closely observing the condition of her assistant. And although Yvonne herself asked Bianca not to worry, Countess Arno could not ignore the situation and pretend that nothing was happening. Then Bianca remembered that she hadn't been wearing her gray squirrel fur coat lately, and luckily it was still kept in the castle. Squirrel fur, although not the most expensive, is still a fairly warm material that can protect against the cold in such weather. So Bianca decided that she would no longer wear this coat and could easily give it to Yvonne so that she would not freeze. The girl also added that since she already had a new luxurious fur coat, Yvonne could do with it as she wanted, but Bianca herself would be pleased if her assistant still wore it. After all, Bianca wanted Yvonne to always be by her side in good condition and not need anything, remaining her reliable support. A few minutes later, the lady's chief assistant was already trying on the new item, and the coat fit her perfectly, as if it had been tailored especially for her. Bianca was genuinely delighted to see how well her item fit. She was pleased to please Yvonne, who had become truly close to her. After that, it was time to move on, and today, their path lay in the area designated for grazing cattle. Vincent explained that the sheep and cows feed on hay harvested in the fall. However, the horses also graze in the winter. It turns out the Count ordered the horses bred to withstand the harsh winter, so Arno's horses are very strong. Bianca was even glad of this news, because if necessary, she could use a horse and leave this place if circumstances suddenly turned against her. Unfortunately, the girl couldn't shake her habit of imagining worst-case scenarios. Despite promising herself that she wouldn't be kicked out again, this fear still haunted her. At that moment, Vincent distracted the young lady by pointing towards the valley. There, against the horizon, Zachary himself was riding on horseback. Bianca was genuinely surprised to see the Count in the saddle, since, as it seemed to her, such matters were usually handled by knights, and not by the owner of the estate himself. She involuntarily slowed down and stood for a while longer, watching the man's movements in the distance. The girl could not take her eyes off the figure of the Count, confidently controlling a powerful and graceful horse, as if this was a natural state for him. In Bianca's eyes, at that moment, he looked like the embodiment of freedom itself, strong, independent, and self-confident. And then the lady remembered Zachary's words about the estate belonging to both of them. However, she understood that he could say this because he already possessed freedom, which she had yet to achieve. Later, Bianca realized that the feeling she had at that moment was not so much jealousy as a hidden inferiority complex. After all, unlike the Count, who has been managing his estates for many years, she is just beginning to learn how to run a household and is taking her first steps in this matter. Meanwhile, Sovor was busy feeding the horses, since it was now his responsibility in the stables to replace Gaspar. The young knight became so accustomed to this work that he himself did not notice how he began to become genuinely attached to the animals, calling them his friends. Absorbed in caring for the horses, Sovor did not immediately notice how uninvited guests appeared in the stable, whose presence could disrupt the usual order. Sovor did not expect to see Her Highness in such a place, but quickly remembered the rumors that in recent days the Countess had been personally inspecting Arno's possessions. For a moment, the guy was even afraid that the lady would start to find fault with the order, because today he hadn't had time to tidy up properly due to extreme fatigue. Looking around, Bianca noticed that there were a surprising number of horses in the stable, despite the fact that a significant number of them were already in the pasture. Vincent then explained that, with the growth of the Count's power, one of the first tasks was to increase the number of war horses, and in Sevran, only the Arno family could boast of such a quantity. Bianca had heard that one war horse cost as much as a house, and so it was difficult for her to even imagine the wealth concentrated in this stable. Sovor could not resist adding that those who had once mocked the Count for his supposedly senseless spending had ultimately suffered defeat and lost their horses, which had gone over to Arno's army. Having fought in numerous wars since childhood, the Count understood the importance of an army's mobility. Even on cold days, he personally checked the condition of the horses. Then Bianca suddenly wondered if she could take one of the horses herself and try riding it. Her words left those around her in slight shock, as Lady Arno had never ridden a horse before, but for her it seemed like an excellent opportunity to learn something new. The experienced knight tried to explain that war horses were very different from ordinary ones. They were intelligent, sensitive, and could react aggressively to an unfamiliar rider. Therefore, to begin her training, Bianca first had to obtain the Count's permission. When Robert learned of this idea, he was genuinely surprised by the changes taking place in Arno. Late in the evening, returning to her chambers after a shower, Bianca with wet hair went straight to bed, without even drying it, wanting to check the work done. The result of the first lace master was truly impressive, and Bianca even thought that, over time, she would be able to create her own patterns and teach others. Tired from the day, the lady lay on her side and tried to sleep, but after a few minutes, there was a knock on the door, and then someone quietly entered her room. Someone's gentle hands were gently rubbing the girl's wet hair. Bianca was sure it was Yvonne caring for her and helping her dry her hair. At that moment, the heroine was overcome with warm memories from her childhood. When she was little, she often went to bed with wet hair, and then Ginny carefully dried it before going to bed. However, when the girl turned to see who exactly was currently tending to her hair, she was surprised to find the Count himself standing in front of her. Bianca was so confused that she couldn't immediately utter a word, only looking at what was happening in stunned silence. Lady Arno had no idea what the Count was doing in her room at such a late hour, as nothing like this had ever happened before. In her past life, nothing like this had happened until she was 20. She couldn't help but wonder if Zachary had changed his mind after her words about an heir. Nevertheless, the girl decided that such a moment could not be missed, and if fate gave her a chance, she should take advantage of it without hesitation. She grabbed the man by the collar with determination and, without thinking, sat on his lap, acting boldly and impulsively. Bianca hovered over him, pausing for a moment, about to move towards his lips, completely giving in to the sudden impulse. But within a second, she was thrown aside. It all happened too quickly. As it turned out, that wasn't what Zachary had come for. He just wanted to ask something, and noticing that his wife had fallen asleep with wet hair, he decided to take care of her. The man was just going to dry her hair and leave quietly so that Bianca wouldn't catch a cold again and could rest peacefully. The girl's imagination proved faster than reality, and her impulse proved premature. The Count, however, acted calmly and confidently, not giving in to emotions. In reality, he just wanted to know if Bianca liked her bodyguard and if she felt uncomfortable with his presence these past few days. However, the girl noted that even if she felt uncomfortable, they would still continue to accompany her, because Zachary felt calmer when someone reliable was next to her. Lady Arno admitted that, despite Gaspard's impressive size and overly prominent physique, he was doing a fairly good job and was keeping a close eye on her safety. However, what was said caused a strange reaction in her husband, which Bianca immediately caught, although she did not fully understand its cause. As soon as the girl finished talking about the bodyguard, Zachary seemed to pull a slight shadow of displeasure across his face, becoming more reserved and cold. Noticing this, Bianca decided to quickly change the subject of the conversation so as not to focus on the tension that had arisen. The lady turned gently to her husband and said that she also had one important question for him that she would like to discuss. The girl asked him to sit next to her and continue drying her hair more carefully. Zachary silently agreed, although he turned his back to her, keeping his distance. After this, Bianca started talking about wanting to learn horse riding, but to do this, she needed her husband's permission. She explained that the Blanchefort family is known as a family of knights, and Zachary himself is also a warrior, so she wanted to live up to that standard. She also added that she knew of cases where noblewomen had learned horsemanship. However, Zachary immediately explained that horse riding is a difficult activity that requires endurance and physical fitness, and he believed that it might be too much of a challenge for Bianca. However, the girl remembered the boy's words about how, if she really wanted something, she only needed to tell Vincent about it, and right now, the young lady was burning with the desire to learn horseback riding. Bianca knew that the difficulty of training didn't mean it was impossible. Her husband agreed to her request, but added that it would be better to start training in the spring, as it would be difficult to find a suitable horse, especially a calm pony, in the cold season. Zachary promised to find her a suitable animal himself, and asked only for a little patience. Now, Bianca only had to tell Vincent that classes would begin in early spring. The lady was so happy that she could not contain her childish joy, although the Count himself paid almost no attention to it, and only calmly turned around, maintaining his usual restraint. At some point, Bianca even felt a little sad. If you think about it, from the very beginning, the Count did not show much interest in his wife. Zachary d'Arnaud always perceived her more as a young, inexperienced girl who still had a poor understanding of how the adult world and the management of an estate worked. Then he suddenly announced that in late spring, he would have to go to the capital of Laozi for the engagement ceremony of Albert, the eldest son of the heir to the throne, His Highness the First Prince. At that moment, Bianca involuntarily remembered that in her past life, everything had happened the same way. In her 19th spring, the Count left the estate for a long time. Zachary went on to explain that this summer marks the 50th anniversary of His Majesty's accession to the throne, so there will be many events taking place in the capital, and he is considering staying there for an extended period. Hearing this, the heroine instantly imagined how events could repeat themselves according to the scenario already familiar to her. It occurred to her that this would lead to them never having an heir, and the Count himself would die in the war. After this, Bianca, as before, will be thrown out of the estate without returning a single coin from her dowry, and then she will live with these regrets until her death, until she fades away in loneliness and illness. The woman from the Arno family, who was once pointed at, will once again become a useless and poor widow without protection and a name. If Bianca lives the same life, then why the hell did she come back in the first place? Realizing the possible consequences and difficult fate, the girl almost burst into tears from the overwhelming emotions and fear. However, at this point, Zachary revealed that he had originally intended to tell her everything before leaving, but now realized that he could no longer make decisions without taking her opinion into account. He noticed that his wife had changed a lot recently. Lady Arno had become more collected and was actively involved in the affairs of the estate. And yet the knight admitted out loud that he would like Bianca to go to Laoz with him and not remain alone in the estate. If the human soul had a form, at the very beginning, it would resemble hard, colorless glass. And that night, the souls of the lady and the Count seemed to slowly begin to be painted in warm, soft shades. The man explained that there would be a lot of people in the capital, as the 50th anniversary of His Majesty's accession to the throne and the engagement ceremony of the Crown Prince were approaching. Zachary also honestly admitted that his wife has a good eye for art and home decor, which could make the trip interesting for her. Therefore, Bianca will not be bored in Laoza at all, and at the very least, will be able to see many luxurious and rare things. Laoz is the capital of the kingdom. It is not just a city, but the heart of the continent and the center of all political and economic life. Of course, the main character of this story agreed to go there with Zachary. Bianca had once been told that a lady's destiny was to be the keeper of the hearth, care for her family, and spend her entire life within the walls of a mansion. However, now she had a premonition that such an opportunity as this might never come again. And Bianca desperately wanted to seize this opportunity. That alone was worth letting go of everything else, and, for the first time in her life, truly doing what she wanted. The next morning, a small meeting was held in Vincent's room. The first thing the butler reported was that the lady had said in the morning that she wanted to temporarily suspend her training in managing the affairs of the mansion. The lady explained to Vincent that she was currently busy with other matters, and that he was already handling the household better than her, so for the time being, he could take full control of the house. Robert thought the girl was simply hinting at her reluctance to get down to business, but Vincent was certain of the opposite. The lady had been spending a lot of time lately with the fairy she had recently brought, and, according to rumors, they needed to get everything done before spring. Now, Zachary was pleasantly surprised and glad that his wife had agreed to go with him. The man was ready to do anything just to hear words of gratitude from her. Several months passed. Spring slowly but surely came into its own. Other estate workers noticed that the lady had been rarely seen lately, whereas before she often walked in the park. Rumors began to circulate around Arno's estate about Milady's absence. Some said she was ill, others that she was gathering with other women to make various trinkets. Of course, none of the servants believed that her creative pursuits could ever be truly significant. Nicola, passing by a group of men, could not stand their empty talk and decided to teach them a lesson so that they would not chatter in vain. After this, the boy ran to the seamstress to inform her of the lady's visit. Meanwhile, one of the craftswomen, a girl named Mary, had already created a beautiful lace design. Mary even admitted that she enjoys creating these kinds of handicrafts much more than traditional weaving. It brings her genuine pleasure, bringing beauty to life. Moreover, the mistress pays honestly if the work is to her liking. Although at first Bianca was known only by rumor, it was enough to see Yvonne once to understand that the lady truly cares for her people. The gray coat of Lady Arno's personal assistant had once belonged to the lady herself, but she gave it away because she no longer wore it. The craftswoman remembered what the lady had said. She would not leave anyone who created something truly beautiful without a reward. That day, a little boy also came to them to share his achievements. Nikolai had made a new candle from the materials he had received earlier and had tried to make the patterns more refined. His creation really turned out to be extraordinarily beautiful, and the boy looked as if he had a real talent hidden within him. More than anything, he wanted to show his candle to the lady as soon as possible, so he kept asking when Bianca would come. Meanwhile, Bianca herself sat alone in the palace, immersed in memories of her difficult past. In a past life, when she was not expecting guests at all, she heard a voice that was already familiar to her. It was the man connected to her destiny, Fernand. When Bianca was still very young, the time came to marry her off. Aunt Ginny was deeply upset by the separation from the girl, and even cried, because the young beauty could have married the Duke, but instead, she was betrothed to a poor baron. The woman considered this decision to be beyond all bounds, and did not understand how Bianca's father could so cruelly dispose of her fate. The nanny could hardly utter words, realizing that from now on, her little Bianca was no longer Blanchefort, but the lady of the house of Arnaud. The father explained to the child that she was obliged to be the keeper of the hearth, to take care of the family, and to spend her last day in the mansion. He firmly stated that there was no turning back, and no matter what happened, Bianca must remain in the Arnaud family. That day, the little girl's future husband approached her. He then promised to take full responsibility for her life. He had neither great wealth nor influence, but he vowed to take care of her. From early childhood, the girls were sworn to the rumor that the Count had mistresses, and that was why he and his mistress had no heir. It was also said that the mistress herself allegedly refused to let the Count into her bed. Everyone knew perfectly well that the lady had married at too young an age, not yet mature as a woman, and was too fragile to immediately become a mother. From this, many concluded that there were no real feelings between Zachary and Bianca, just the fulfillment of duty, since he supposedly already had a loved one. Fernand, suddenly appearing behind Bianca, quietly remarked that Zachary's heart was already taken. His words sounded as if he was trying to convince the girl to give herself to another man by playing on her doubts. He once promised to fill her loneliness with his love, promised to be there and warm her heart. However, even in such a difficult situation, Bianca did not want to make contact with this man. In his past life, he swore that he would not leave her in trouble, but he disappeared the moment the lady was kicked out of Arnaud's house. What hurt her most was that she had given Fernand everything, absolutely everything, without leaving anything for herself, and he had thrown away her feelings like useless trash. And when the main character lost everything and especially needed support, Fernand simply left her. However, the young man himself stated that he promised her love, not eternal love. He just wanted to console the girl. Fernand turned out not to be a savior, but merely a man who once became a temporary consolation. Previously, Bianca thought she was loved and that she loved in return, but now she understood. There had never been true feelings between them. Now, having found herself in a new body and a new life, the heroine realized that she had to stay close to the Count, even if his heart and mind were occupied with the image of another woman. The lady was crying, choking on memories of her past life, and she was suddenly distracted from these thoughts by Zachary, who suddenly appeared next to her. At that moment, she clearly understood that the Count was the only one who had always been there, no matter what. But despite this realization, Bianca couldn't stop crying because she still couldn't get what she wanted most. Zachary saw the despair in his wife's eyes and suggested that she take a short walk around the estate's grounds. The two spent so little time together that they knew almost nothing about each other. The man Bianca always watched from afar, afraid to approach, was a tall and stately man who seemed cold and stern because of his reticence. He always seemed like a person who had little understanding of emotions, who was alien to warm feelings and tenderness. However, at that moment, he unexpectedly called the girl to him and pointed his hand into the distance at the field. When Bianca looked closely, she saw a beautiful pony standing under a tree. This pony became the very promise that Zachary made to his wife in the winter. After that, they came closer together, and Bianca was finally able to touch her dream. The pony was very affectionate. It seemed that the animal would not run away, even if it was not on a leash. In that moment, the girl experienced an incredible feeling. For the first time, she was being given something so precious, a new opportunity and hope. Bianca found it difficult to find the words to express everything she felt. The young man, in turn, was so happy to see sincere, positive emotions on his wife's face that he unexpectedly moved almost right up to her. He quietly whispered in her ear, asking her to try riding the horse. Then, with careful and confident movements, he supported her by the waist, helping her to settle onto the pony. From this day on, Bianca was finally supposed to start learning to ride. Lady Arno was sincerely grateful for the opportunity given to her by her husband, but still did not want to take up any more of his time. She suggested simply asking Vincent to find her a separate teacher. However, Zachary said that she was not taking up his time at all, since teaching his own wife was his personal desire. He admitted that he regretfully thinks about how little time he spent with her before and how many moments together he missed. After this, he carefully released Bianca's hands, making sure that she was sitting confidently in the saddle, and invited her to explore the estate grounds on horseback. Zachary assumed that his wife would be heading to the seamstresses again today, so they headed towards the sewing workshop. On the way to the seamstresses, he wanted to ask why Bianca so rarely called him dear, as she did before. But at the last moment, he felt awkward and changed the subject, starting to ask her about the work of the craftswomen. The lady was surprised that Zachary was showing interest in this, although she could easily guess that Gaspard and Vincent had probably already told him a lot. It was time to explain to the young man that although the materials were quite cheap, the lace itself was expensive and valuable. Miss confidently stated that one day these products will be able to conquer the whole world and become something truly significant. The lady could not reveal the true reason for her confidence, so she only added that if everything really worked out as she expected, it would be a huge advantage for the Arnault family. Moreover, the girl emphasized that she wants to have solid ground under her feet in case something goes wrong in the future. Now, Bianca didn't want to remain a person known only by her background or her marriage. Most of all, she wanted to simply be a successful Bianca, strong and independent. After Zachary listened to her attentively, he even smiled for a moment. He was so proud of his wife. He was pleased to see such mature and confident thinking in her. The girl also added that she still hopes for the appearance of an heir. She recalled her husband's words about not wanting to have a child during wartime and acknowledged that she should become stronger rather than waste time. Then Zachary remarked that if they had a child, his wife would be remembered not as a lace maker, but as the mother of the future Count Arnaud. However, Bianca didn't see anything wrong with this. She believed that a married woman should think about her husband and heir, but at the same time, it was hard for her because her husband was constantly on the front lines. It was at that moment that Zachary de Arnaud first truly realized how difficult things were for his wife. He also added that a woman can live her life before, during, and after childbirth, while her husband, a knight at the forefront of the troops, can die in battle at any moment. Suddenly, Bianca remembered a story she had once heard out of the corner of her ear. It told of a young man, the second son of the Viscount Vigue, who was expelled from his home at the age of 16. It was a story about a truly difficult past of a strong knight who, at such a young age, faced the injustice and cruelty of the world. Without a squire or support, he created his own name from scratch. Such was the path of Zachary de Arnaud. Two souls who were perhaps destined to be closer to each other met under less than ideal circumstances. Bianca was too young when she married the knight, and he, in turn, almost immediately went to the battlefield without even having time to realize what was happening. Could it be that all this time the Count was really worried about his young wife? At that very moment, joyful cries were heard nearby. The craftswoman and a little boy greeted the lady, seeing her riding a horse. The common people made it clear that they had been waiting for her for a long time to show off their new works. Bianca had to leave Zachary's pony and go over to her charges to appreciate their work. As they parted, the experienced knight said that if she gave the pony a name, she would be able to establish a connection with her faster, so Lady Arnaud should think about it. This became the first task in her riding training with Zachary de Arnaud. The 19th spring in Bianca's life began exactly like this, with new steps and changes. These events seemed to foreshadow much, because this beginning of the season was noticeably different from all the previous ones. Meanwhile, in Loaz, the capital of Sevran, completely different events were unfolding. The imperial person was secretly kissing her lover on the porch. However, their time with Jacob was suddenly interrupted by a male silhouette appearing behind them. The girl was afraid that she might be seen next to the man, and she ran away quickly, without even figuring out who exactly noticed them. The presence of the servant alone was enough for her. Meanwhile, an assistant approached His Highness the Second Prince to inform him that Zachary de Arnaud would be arriving in the capital with his wife. This news clearly interested Jacob. The young man eagerly anticipated meeting the Ironblood's wife, as spring this year promised to be especially eventful. At that time, His Majesty King Sevran had 3 children. Her Majesty, the First Queen, raised Crown Prince Gautier and Princess Audrey. And Her Majesty, the Second Queen, gave the world a second prince, Jacob. According to the traditions of the kingdom, the throne passed to the eldest son, so it was obvious to everyone that the first prince, Gautier, would be the next king. One day, when Jacob was at his estate, Count Blanchefort unexpectedly approached him. The count did not arrive alone. His son Joachim was with him. Then Jacob remarked out loud that he had recently heard some very interesting news. The second prince mentioned that Count Arnaud was planning to come to the capital with his wife. The fair-haired man remembered very well that the count's wife was the daughter of Blanchefort himself, the very girl who had been married off to an adult knight at a young age. Jacob said that his mother was extremely worried about the fate of a distant relative, Countess Blanchefort, who was married to a man she did not know at all. For a moment, Joachim thought that Jacob was being too rude to the count, but Monsieur Blanchefort himself calmly replied that the concern of Her Majesty the Second Queen was quite natural. The man explained that now that same Baron had become a count and one of the key people on the continent, so no one would be able to resist Sevran. When His Highness the First Prince Gautier ascended the throne. In response, the second prince only smiled slyly and remarked that he was eagerly awaiting the day when he could meet this hero in person, and if he was lucky, his wife as well. The unexpected guest's son considered Jacob's statements offensive and completely unacceptable in relation to their family. Joachim understood that they were on different sides, but this did not change the fact that the actions of Count Arnaud cannot be devalued, because this man risked his life to repel the attacks of Aragon and defend their lands. However, the father of his youngest son had no intention of entering into an argument, so he simply calmly asked Joachim to return home and write a letter to Arnaud, informing him that upon his arrival, the count wished to meet Bianca as soon as possible. The youngest son was absolutely delighted, because this meant that he would be able to see Bianca again for the first time in 10 years. The father was sure that the girl was now living the life of a full-fledged wife, since she had already turned 19 this year. Meanwhile, Bianca herself looked extremely exhausted, as she had been actively learning horse riding and had spent all her energy on it. From the intense physical exertion, her legs and buttocks ached so much that she literally fell from fatigue, and at that moment, she was caught by the strong arms of Monsieur de Arnaud. The man supported his wife and believed that her decision to take up horse riding was very timely. If she continued training, her endurance would increase significantly and her health would improve. The pony has already been given a name. She was named Isabel, and now the animal has become good friends with her new owner. Today, the girl could say goodbye to her horse until tomorrow, having completed another training session. The lady did her best and has already decided that tomorrow she will return to her studies with renewed vigor. Besides, she had eaten almost nothing all day, so now she had very little strength left. Looking at his lady, Zachary was sure that the more time the girl spent in the fresh air, the better her appetite would become. The young man continued to hold his lady in his arms, because he believed that it would be better than forcing his tired wife to walk on her own. Thus, before the trip to Laos, the couple were able to spend much more time together. While this wasn't enough to make up for lost time, it was enough to understand that their coldness wasn't due to a lack of feelings. Lady Arnaud was now becoming quite good at staying in the saddle and controlling her horse. At some point, the young man again decided to ask why she had recently stopped calling him darling. Indeed, the main character had often addressed the count in exactly this way before. The girl was surprised that he remembered such a trifle and was very embarrassed, so she quickly changed the subject, saying that he must have simply misunderstood her. Besides, it seemed to her that they were not yet close enough to call each other that way. Although they were formally married, their relationship was still far from being a real marriage. The guy listened calmly to the lady's words, but admitted that he thought it was a hint that they should start addressing each other in a more special way. However, Bianca did not forget that now Zachary was her riding teacher, and she was only his student, so she decided that they would have time to discuss all this later. Finally, the lady confidently declared that soon she and her horse Isabel would be able to surpass even an experienced knight and his horse Noah. This statement sounded quite loud and even made the man laugh, but at that moment the girl noticed that when he smiled, he became surprisingly similar to a child. Nevertheless, Zachary accepted this peculiar challenge and did not doubt his wife's strength at all. Moreover, he looked forward to the day when he could see her success with his own eyes. Rumors that the lady was doing something mysterious and spending money on luxurious candles still raged. However, along with this, new rumors emerged, this time about changes in the relationship between the count and his wife. A strange sense of anticipation and hope hung over the estate that the lady would soon have an heir. Around this time, a letter from Blanchefort finally reached its addressee. It was the first letter from the count during the entire preparation for Bianca's wedding. In fact, this was only the second letter ever to bear Blanchefort's seal. After reading its contents, Zachary told Vincent that the count wanted to meet Bianca immediately upon arriving in Laos. It was obvious that the man had something in mind. Zachary believed that he should be the one to tell Bianca about this at the right moment, and until then, he should not spread the contents of the letter. After all, even the smallest miscalculations can turn into serious problems over time. and all this happened just a day before leaving for the capital of Sevran, Laos. That day, Bianca was extremely irritated. Having learned of this too late, she was especially angry at Vincent, who, in her opinion, had deliberately not told her beforehand. The letter emphasized the Count's strong desire to meet the hero of Sevran, and, judging by the tone, this desire only grew stronger with each passing day. Mr. Blanchefort also mentioned the Countess, but he looked forward to meeting her with much less impatience. After carefully examining the letter, Zachary noticed that the request to meet his daughter was written too formally. Judging by the style, it was most likely written by the older brother, and it seemed he was not much different from his father. At that moment, Zachary remembered that Count Blanchefort had never been interested in Bianca's well-being. According to Vincent, the girl never corresponded with her father, and now Zachary began to seriously doubt whether he should allow his wife to meet with the family, who had not remembered her for 9 years. Gazing thoughtfully at Bianca's reflection in the window, he suddenly noticed her hair. He'd rarely seen her with her hair up before, as riding lessons had only just begun. However, the man honestly admitted to himself that loose hair suited her much better. The day before the departure for Laos, the entire Arnaud estate was engulfed in a flurry of packing. At one point, they even decided to leave 15 boxes of the mistress's belongings behind to ease the journey. The girl, like a true fashionista, immediately protested and loudly declared that she hadn't brought much with her. However, compared to Zachary, who had only 8 boxes, her luggage truly did look excessive. That same day, Bianca noticed her husband's belongings. They looked rather modest, and from the outside, it might have seemed as if the county of Arnaud was truly destitute. However, the girl quickly remembered that this was not the case. They had plenty of war horses and a strong army, and yet, Bianca couldn't understand why her husband's clothes looked so simple and worn. Even the fur on these clothes looked rough and of completely poor quality in the girl's opinion. It seemed to Bianca that her esteemed husband's things looked more like ordinary rags than like the clothes of a count. In fact, Zachary's outfits were made from good materials, but they did not at all correspond to the lady's aesthetic tastes. Slightly irritated, the girl asked Vincent to empty the drawers so that she could choose more suitable clothes for his lordship herself. Bianca understood that this was an excellent opportunity to take advantage of the capital's selection and completely change her husband's style. She did not forget that her husband was an outstanding warrior and a representative of a noble family, and in such things, he looked too simple. Besides, the girl couldn't imagine walking arm in arm with him if he looked so unpresentable. She definitely wouldn't be able to stand the ridicule. Zachary watched this whole scene from the side, barely holding back a smile. Bianca managed to take control even of Vincent. At that moment, the man noticed that Sauveur was circling near his wife. In fact, the knight simply wanted to get his master's old things, since Bianca was clearly going to get rid of them. Sauveur insisted that his build was most like that of the Count among the knights of the guard, and therefore the clothes would suit him. The lady did not argue with the persistent young man and allowed him to take these things. Besides, she no longer had the strength for unnecessary arguments. After this, Bianca decided to rest a little and then tidy up her luggage, although there was almost nothing left to sort through. At the moment when the girl was about to return to the castle, she accidentally met the Count's gaze. Lately, she had seen him almost every day, but for some reason, it was becoming more and more pleasant to watch this man. But as soon as their gazes met, Zachary suddenly turned away and became slightly embarrassed. It seemed to him that it was not proper for a grown man to secretly watch a young girl like that. At some point, he even began to worry that my lady might feel awkward because of his close attention. When Zachary first married Bianca, he found it difficult to even get close to her. He had absolutely no idea how to communicate with such a young wife, and the constant distance only made things worse. Now they could calmly look into each other's eyes, and sometimes the girl even responded with a soft smile. Zachary felt a strange sensation. By his own orders, Gaspar always stood by Bianca's side, protecting her, while Sauveur could easily strike up a conversation with her. This caused an inexplicable tension in the man, especially since the moment Bianca first smiled at him. Remembering Count Blanchefort's words that marriage should serve personal success and the security of the state, Zachary, for a long time, calmly treated the formality of their union. He tolerated criticism and didn't pay attention to the fact that their marriage lacked real intimacy, but over time, it no longer seemed so insignificant to him. Previously, he felt only pity for Bianca because she was dragged into adulthood too early. But now he sincerely hoped that she would no longer have to suffer because of the responsibilities into which she had fallen against her will. Meanwhile, the day of their departure to the capital of Sevran was approaching. Bianca wanted to ask her husband if he noticed how she waved to him yesterday, but Zachary was busy talking to Vincent at that moment. The lady got into the carriage, and throughout the long and tiring journey, thought only about when she would be able to talk to the Count. At that moment, Bianca could not even imagine that the wheel of fate, capable of turning her life upside down, had already set in motion. When all the preparations were completed, it was time to hit the road. The chief commander of the Knights of the Guard solemnly announced the beginning of their road to Laos. Several days had passed since the departure of the lady and the Count to the capital of Sevran. Meanwhile, the butler continued to faithfully carry out the Countess's orders. That day, he brought the needlewomen the golden linen thread they had requested. It was then that Mary noticed Vincent literally beaming with good humor. Although the man himself attributed this to the good weather, it was obvious to the girls that the reason lay elsewhere. The butler felt calmer now that his mistress, known for her spending habits, had left, and now there were fewer reasons for grumbling. However, in reality, he liked Bianca. Otherwise, he would have long ago transferred all responsibilities to her and would not have helped so diligently. One of the craftswomen noticed that before the lady hardly left her room and only spent money, but now her relationship with the Count had changed so much that perhaps the heir was not long away. The good news was that lace making was rapidly developing. Before leaving, Bianca promised to present the work of the craftswomen in Loeys at the first opportunity. The senior craftswoman insisted that everyone continue to refine the patterns and improve the quality of their work, and also reminded them that Vincent would help them with everything they needed. The heroine promised the craftswomen that from now on, they would not just be seamstresses and weavers, but true masters of lace and Arno. Before her long-awaited departure, the girl did not forget about little Nicola. Lady Arno told the young man that she was going to visit the sanctuary and thank the gods for sending such talented craftsmen as this young man to Arno. In a short time, from winter to spring, these masters, in their own words, acquired a lot thanks to the lady. People sincerely hoped for the safe return of the lady who had invested her resources and faith in their talent and potential. A little later, during the journey of guests from the kingdom of Arno, it turned out that the main road was unusable due to a landslide. There was only one path left for the horses to pass, but the carriage could not pass there. It would have to be literally pushed by hand. Since the travelers had a lot of luggage, the detour would take about 2 weeks. Then Robert also reported good news. Beyond the destroyed section of the road, there was a village where the knights planned to stop. If they choose to take the detour, they will have to spend the night in the open. The knights of the guard turned to their captain in confusion, asking what they should do. Zachary understood that it was impossible to drag the carriage and luggage by hand, so he suggested stopping for the night first, and then moving around. As Bianca was getting out of the carriage, Sovor, like a true gentleman, hurried toward her. However, before he could offer her his hand, he was distracted by Robert, who informed the Countess that her husband was looking for her. There was a bustle all around. Robert asked the Countess not to hide if she felt unwell, as they still had a long journey ahead of them. At that very moment, the Count himself approached them, inviting his wife to take a short walk. Perhaps because they had not spoken for a long time, the girl felt a particularly keen sense of joy at seeing her young master again. Now, when the heroine looked at the Count, her heart fluttered and beat without stopping. The young couple moved a little further toward the stream. Zachary showed her the source of the Arno River, the beginning of the waterway that flowed past their mansion. The distance to it, which would have taken about 2 days on the fastest horse, was covered by petals floating on the water in just half a day. The spectacle was truly beautiful, and at moments like these, Bianca became acutely aware of how much she had missed by not leaving the mansion for years. The lady also mentioned that Sovor wanted to show her this place. In response, the gentleman noted that she had been spending too much time with his knight lately. However, the girl immediately sensed a hint of jealousy in his voice and asked him not to say that again. But their conversation didn't have time to dwell on that topic. It was time to leave. The Count took her hand and led her away. For Bianca and Zachary, the gesture didn't seem like anything special. They weren't holding hands for the sake of knight and lady status. They did it almost unconsciously, just to get closer to each other. And that was precisely why the Count's heart was restless. The words he was about to say to Milady could once again erect a wall between them, the very one they had so painstakingly torn down recently. The first thing he decided to do was to carefully find out from Miss Arnaud whether she had had a good relationship with her brother when she lived in Blanchefort. The girl confirmed that the relationship was not bad, because after her mother's death, she only had a brother left. However, this young man was too cunning for a child. He inherited this from his father. Bianca, however, was certain that Joachim certainly took after his father, since he hadn't sent her a single message in 10 years. Although she could not say this with complete certainty, because she was too young at the time, the girl remembered well that her brother always shared everything with her. Joachim shared everything except one thing: chocolate cake. Milady always got only small pieces of dessert, but she wanted more, so she invariably tried to take the boy's portion. One day, Bianca finally managed to do it. She even remembered how quickly she ate the cake, afraid that it would be taken away from her. But she remembered this day especially well, because then she was told about her upcoming wedding with the Count. The word itself was unfamiliar to her at the time, so she simply continued listening, not understanding its meaning. If Bianca had known what was hidden behind that word, she would have refused immediately, even if it meant throwing a real tantrum. But then she simply took the Count by the hand and followed him, not even suspecting that she would no longer be able to return to Blanchefort. These memories hit the girl's mind sharply, and her mood instantly worsened. She couldn't hold back her tears, but she couldn't confess everything to the prince, so she just said that she was just tired. At the same time, she recalled how her father, being a supporter of the first prince, took the lead in the fight against the invasion of Aragon on behalf of his son-in-law and master. Joachim followed his father, and that was where the history of the Blanchefort family seemed to end. It becomes heavy in the soul to think about the near future, in which there may be no one close to you. Now the time had come for the Count to tell his wife about the letter from Blanchefort. Zachary said that her relatives wanted to meet her. However, he did not insist. If she did not want to, she always had the right to refuse. The Count was truly concerned about his wife, and sometimes the main character of this story caught herself thinking how she had not noticed his kindness before. At that moment, the lady was so grateful to him that she gently touched his lips with her fingertips. The guy, without wasting a second, instinctively reached for her hand. This moment happened too suddenly, but now the girl did not object, as if she felt that there might not be another opportunity. However, their solitude was interrupted by the carriage door suddenly opening. The lady's assistant announced that they had received news about the need to spend the night on the road. When Yvonne realized she had interrupted the couple's moment, she immediately began to apologize, but Bianca didn't pay much attention to it. It was not difficult to guess that spending the night here was the very second piece of news that Mr. Arno wanted to report. The guy felt awkward. After all, he was trying to avoid the lady having to spend the night in the carriage. Although the girl herself saw nothing wrong with spending the night on the road, she was more concerned about something else, where the knight himself would sleep. Only one option immediately came to mind: to sleep with his wife in the same carriage. However, this even sounded rather awkward, and in order to diffuse the embarrassed atmosphere, the guy said that he had already made a decision. He would sleep outside, and Bianca could not worry about anything and calmly settle into the carriage with Yvonne. Finally, before leaving, he asked to continue this conversation later. In fact, the Count wanted to discuss the issue of Bianca meeting her family, but their feelings were so strong and confused that they again became distracted and forgot about it. However, throughout the entire trip, they were unable to return to this conversation. 10 whole days had passed since leaving Arno's estate. They were originally supposed to arrive in the capital a few days earlier, but eventually made it to Laos. Laos, the capital of Sevran, is a city that for 100 years maintained the balance between Aragon and Castia. Above its fortresses rose the flag of the Sevran family, a pattern of sunbeams and red roses entwined with golden thorns. The spectacle was so majestic that it seemed almost impossible for an ordinary person to perceive. As soon as the guests arrived at the capital's main castle, Sovor loudly called out his name, announcing his arrival by order of His Majesty the King. After the palace servants noticed the banner with the image of a black wolf, they immediately realized that it was Count Zachary de Arnaud in front of them. People greeted Zachary with sincere respect, as a hero of his time, a furious count. This is how the locals greeted the man who had always been at the forefront of the battles against Aragon. The people truly loved the hero who saved Sevran. On the way to His Majesty's residence, 3 huge gates had to be crossed. Even after they had already reached Laos territory, they still had to travel a long way to reach the palace, which from a distance resembled a giant mountain. And now this long and grueling road was finally coming to an end. When the sun was at its zenith, the young men of the Arno family arrived at the castle of Laosa. Upon arrival, palace officials informed him that His Majesty was now in Princess Audrey's garden. The young man explained that the meeting was private and would take place in a relaxed atmosphere, so he asked the lady not to worry. However, the beauty could not get rid of her excitement so easily, and to calm her down a little, the guy took her hand. The Louise Gardens were renowned for their diversity of plants from across the continent. Princess Audrey and the Queen had their own gardens, and the King was particularly fond of his daughter and her garden. The very fact that he arranged a meeting with the Count in the Princess's garden spoke of a high level of trust. Finally, the young people met His Majesty, who had been expecting guests for a long time. The first thing Zachary did, as befits a polite guest, was express his joy at the opportunity to see His Majesty in good health. The owner of the palace also did not hide his sincere joy at meeting Countess Bianca. Victor de Sevran immediately introduced himself to the aristocrat, giving his full name. The king sincerely admitted that he had been looking forward to this meeting and wanted to see them even before his death. His son allowed himself to remark that Milady bore a striking resemblance to the late Countess Blanchefort, and then introduced himself as the eldest Prince Gautier de Sevran. This young man was quite close to Bianca's father. The guy continued to shower Miss with compliments, because he really liked the beauty. He even thought for a moment about the bouquet he had prepared for his wife, but then he remembered that Count Arno would soon give Bianca another rose, one that never fades. Afterwards, the king announced that the North Tower, where the guests would be staying, was one of the most picturesque parts of Laos Castle. Since the journey was long, he suggested they rest. When they retired to the prepared chambers, the girl suddenly remembered that in her past life, the first Prince Gautier died, without ever having managed to gain power over Sevran. The throne was ultimately inherited not by Albert, the son of the first prince, but by the second prince, Jacob. Such was the history of Sevran, which Bianca knew from her past experience. She understood that her family and the Arno clan supported the first prince, but under these circumstances, Gautier was unlikely to succeed to the throne. Now, it seemed to the girl that the destruction of family relationships was already predetermined. However, Bianca suddenly thought about paying attention to the second prince. At that moment, she was so deep in thought that she didn't notice how she collided with a person passing by. The blonde was the first to rush to apologize, which put the lady in an awkward position. However, Count de Arno perceived such casual closeness extremely coldly, so he loudly called Bianca to him. The girl pushed the stranger away and hurried to her boyfriend, apologizing. She grabbed Zachary's hand and promised never to let him go again. It was at this moment that the young man learned the origin of Countess Arno. He remembered that there had already been a commotion in the palace due to the arrival of the Count. To prevent the girl from continuing the conversation with the second prince, Zachary himself apologized for his wife's oversight. This was their first personal acquaintance with the second prince, the one who would in the future inherit power over Sevran and the entire continent. Immediately after this, the aristocrat introduced himself. Jacob de Sevran welcomed the guest to his castle. He then told the girl an interesting fact, that her mother was his mother's niece, adding that he was glad to meet such a close relative. The man also noted that he knew about her mother's connection with Severin, although she never maintained relations with the royal family. Such unpleasant words required a dignified response, but Bianca didn't forget to put him in his place. She calmly explained that being related didn't make her part of the royal family and had no particular significance to her. The beauty confidently emphasized that she does not consider herself a member of the royal family, and there is nothing remarkable about this. At some point, the girl was so offended by the second prince's closeness that without thinking, she sharply remarked, "It is unacceptable to speak like that to a member of the royal family." However, Jacob took her words calmly and even apologized, admitting he might have offended Miss. He explained that they had just met and he simply wanted to get to know her better, but he had overstepped his bounds. He also added that the girl gave the impression of being a sincere person and asked her not to hide her feelings and to be as honest with him as she was now. In conclusion, he said that if anything bothered her during her stay in Laos, she could contact him personally. This second prince looked at Bianca too openly, although he knew perfectly well that she was married, and this was extremely unpleasant. Then the girl decided to show how much she valued her husband. She snuggled closer to Zachary, called him dear, and, complaining of fatigue, suggested that they return to their quarters. Zachary quickly grasped her intention, politely apologized to His Highness, and again emphasized that his wife was tired after a long journey, asking permission to leave first. Finally, he politely thanked the prince, and, together with Bianca, headed towards the guest quarters. On the way to the room, he asked his wife to call him dear in such situations, and gently but firmly reminded her to avoid meeting the second prince, no matter what happened, even if he was not around. Bianca made it clear to him that he shouldn't worry so much. After all, she was from the Blanchefort family and Arnaud's wife, and her marriage was also concluded for the sake of supporting the first prince. At such moments, Zachary still couldn't get rid of his anxiety, because the second prince seemed to him a dangerous and unpredictable person. It was impossible to tell from this blonde what he was planning, and one could only hope that Bianca would not approach him again. The girl, who had already lived this life once, internally agreed that the second prince was truly treacherous. It was enough to remember the scandals associated with him to have no doubt about it. The most notorious of these was connected with his secret 20-year conspiracy with Aragon, an enemy country. The truth that the Aragonese invasion was merely a hoax orchestrated by Jacob was revealed only after he had effectively destroyed the sovereignty of Sevron. Then, having come to power, Jacob married the Princess of Aragon to strengthen the alliance between the countries. However, sometime later, an incident occurred. While Bianca was quietly finishing the rest of her bread, she heard the maids discussing how the second prince's bride had been unfaithful to him. There were rumors that due to her husband's constant busyness, the girl was unable to cope with loneliness. And although it was believed that the busier the husband, the more modest and reserved the wife should be, infidelity was severely condemned in such circles. In her past life, Bianca felt as if these words were addressed to her personally, and she couldn't help but listen. She even remembered that the bread she'd eaten then tasted like sand. However, now the grown lady understood that that woman was Jacob's wife, the Princess of Aragon. This girl shared her loneliness, caused by her husband's coldness, with his guard, just like Bianca herself, who once fell in love with Fernand. Aragon used the betrayal of its own princess as a pretext for pressure. The country was forced to submit to Jacob's demands, and then effectively deprived of its sovereignty. Lady Arnaud remembered Fernand leaving her, saying that they should finish everything because he no longer needed to be around. It seemed as if it was part of a pre-written script. After his death, Fernand finally abandoned Bianca. Arnaud is the homeland of Zachary, under the rule of Viscount Vigue. It was difficult to remember anyone who condemned Fernand, or that guard, while Bianca herself and the Princess of Aragon ultimately suffered the most, even losing their names in the memory of history. The main character was so immersed in her own thoughts that it took her husband several minutes to bring her attention back. However, when she finally came to, she suddenly started talking about Zachary's clothes. She noted that today he looked especially dignified, and even declared that her husband was much more attractive than the second prince. Moreover, like any man, Zachary was pleased to hear such words from his wife. He'd often been told he was tall, but this was the first time he'd heard a compliment about his appearance. The girl also noted that the women Zachary met were probably just embarrassed, but in response, the guy only calmly noted that Bianca should not talk about women who do not exist. Mr. Arnaud was quite serious when he said this. If he really had a hidden connection, it would have been much more offensive. To distract themselves from the meeting with the second prince, the couple began to share stories from their lives, trying to maintain a light atmosphere and warm each other with words. Milady and the Count did not even suspect that the confrontation between the second prince and the Arnaud family had already begun. Finally, the young people arrived at their quarters. The room looked luxurious, and the windows offered a truly picturesque view, although the interior itself was no less impressive. Everything in these sleeping quarters was done to the highest standard. It was time to take a closer look at the bed on which the girl would be spending the next few days. But at the same moment, Lady Arnaud noticed that there was only one bed in the room, and this meant that the Count would have to stay in the same room with her. No other orders had been received. Of course, they'd grown closer recently, but Bianca still wasn't sure they were ready for this level of intimacy. That evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she suddenly remembered her goal. Her mission was to produce an heir as soon as possible. The girl thought that their first night at Arnaud's castle would be completely different, and now she was very worried about the fact that they would have to share one room. A few minutes later, Zachary himself entered the room. He'd already taken a bath, and for the first time, Bianca saw him so at home. Silently, he sat down next to her, and they settled awkwardly on the edge of the bed without further words. And although the time for action had come, the guy's hand slowly touched the young lady's silky hair. Then their lips began to move closer together at a calm but confident pace. However, only a few seconds passed, and the girl returned to reality. All this turned out to be just her fantasy about the upcoming night. Zachary calling Bianca brought her out of her own imagination. After this, the girl awkwardly asked where he planned to sleep, on the right or left side of the bed. However, the guy was genuinely surprised and told his wife that he was going to settle in the next room. This made Bianca feel even more awkward. She said she was tired from the journey and asked the young man to leave so as not to further increase the tension. Then the guy, after thinking for a bit, sat down on the other side and calmly noted that since she usually chose the left side, he would take the right. He added that it seemed that even the Count himself began to notice how everything was gradually changing between them, and for the better. After this, at that moment, the guy noticed how nervous his wife was and said that if she didn't want to, he could meet with Count Blanchefort himself. However, the girl noted that they were already in the capital, which meant that this meeting was inevitable in any case. The next morning, when the heroine was getting ready for the meeting, she decided to prepare new clothes for herself and her companion in time for the visit to her father and the Count. Bianca was, after all, the wife of a count, not a baron, as she had been at the time of their wedding. So now she had to live up to her new status. And although now the beauty was sure that she had to show in any way that her life had become better than before, much better than before, the lady, Yvonne, seeing her mistress's agitation, tried to calm her down and said that early in the morning she would set out to find the capital's most famous seamstress. Countess d'Arnaud's personal assistant easily noticed her anxiety because Bianca was not usually so talkative. It was obvious that the girl was very worried about the upcoming meeting with her family, so she continued to discuss it until late in the evening, until she went to bed. 9 years passed. The Countess had become a caring and mature woman, but as soon as the conversation turned to the Blanchefort family, she felt like a little girl again. Early the next morning, the messenger Arnaud arrived at the Blanchefort residence in the center of L'Oise to deliver a letter from the Count. Bianca's Joachim, however, at this moment, it turned out that early in the morning, the second Prince Jacob decided to visit the Blanchefort estate. When Count Blanchefort came out into the reception hall, Jacob immediately behaved in an extremely friendly manner and explained that he had dropped in on the estate during his walk because he happened to be nearby. The second, he remarked with a slight smile, what a pity it was that he could not give these flowers to the Count, supposedly from his brother's wife, or from Audrey's garden. Having mentioned the princess's name, Jacob began to explain that in their country, everyone knew about his special relationship with Audrey. The girl allegedly was very upset, even by his presence, and forbade him from approaching the garden. At the same time, he looked as if he considered himself more attractive than his older brother, although behind the external ease, there was a hidden mockery that made him feel uncomfortable. The young gentleman then announced that the king was going to hold an audience in Audrey's garden. Jacob, however, in fact, Mr. Blanc, as his moreover, at that moment, someone forgot that the second Prince Jacob has eyes and ears everywhere in L'Oise, not only in L'Oise, but also in other parts of Sevran. Perhaps, looking at the second, after marrying and receiving his new status, he changed his family name to Arnaud, and Jacob missed his chance to get closer to this young knight. But this time, the second prince was determined to establish contact, not only with Count Arnaud, but also with his wife. His pretty wife also aroused Jacob's interest. As soon as the Count's conversation with the second prince ended, the youngest son approached his father to find out if he understood what exactly their uninvited guest wanted to convey. Count Blanchefort remarked aloud that the second prince had said exactly as much as he wanted to. Apparently, this young man had inherited his resourcefulness from his mother, which could not be said of his brothers and sisters. At that moment, as the Count, her upset, this occurred during the period when the first queen was recovering from the birth of her first prince, Gautier. The second queen was not only her relative, but also a close friend, which made the situation even more painful. The event, moreover, unfortunately, after this, this is why Jacob de Sevran grew up as an illegitimate child and was only recognized as a prince years later, through many ups and downs. After the second prince got into the carriage to go about his business, he looked quite satisfied. Jacob was in a good mood because he had got hold of something valuable. Although there was not a single suitable miniature of the Countess in the house, he still decided to take the portrait of little Bianca. From that moment on, the prince ordered his assistant to seek out these families' weaknesses and ways to disrupt their relationships. Then he would be able to gain power not only over his brother's lands, but also over their allies. His assistant turned out to be that very same Viscount Vigue. The young lady was left alone in the huge castle, and most of all wanted to return home, to the Blanchefort estate. However, the father reminded his daughter that he had not told her not to return to Blanchefort, no matter what happened. A moment later, Lady Arnaud opened her eyes. It all turned out to be a nightmare. Only a few minutes later, did the young lady's memories return. The first thing she remembered was that today she had asked her assistant, Yvonne, to find a first-class seamstress in L'Oise. However, the man asked the lady to rest first and promised that when she felt better, he would order a dress and outerwear for her himself. The girl then explained that it wasn't she who needed the clothes, but her companion. Imagine the young man's surprise when he realized his wife was concerned about his wardrobe, despite her condition. The Count was worried about his ailing wife, because he knew it had more to do with her clothes than just her clothes, but he couldn't understand why she was so afraid of meeting his family. Since last winter, they'd been spending much more time together, but a few months couldn't fill a 9-year gap. The Count always regretted being too cold toward her in the past. The next morning, Bianca needed careful makeup to cover the dark circles under her eyes, caused by her illness. While the maid cleaned her up, Zachary sat nearby and watched his wife. He noticed that she still had a high fever and suggested postponing the meeting with the family until she had had enough rest. However, the heroine objected. The event to celebrate the engagement of the crown prince was already very soon, so both Zachary and her father would be very busy in the near future. Then the man decided to try applying makeup to his Mrs. Face himself. This initiative was so spontaneous that it greatly surprised the beauty. While the guy was applying makeup to the girl, he repeated to Bianca once again that she was not obliged to do anything she did not want to do, although the lady assured him that she was fine. Besides, if he did nothing, nothing would change. In reality, Bianca was just a little worried. What if her father saw Zachary's clothes and thought his wife was abusing him? However, the caring husband promised to take care of it. Nevertheless, Bianca still had to mock Zachary, because after his efforts, she began to look even more sickly. The guy got so carried away applying blush that due to his lack of skill, he made her cheeks too red. While the Count tried to calm the Countess, she came to her senses and decided to restore her makeup to its normal state. But as she headed to the guest room, she felt her legs tremble again. Zachary immediately noticed that his companion was behaving just as she had before her audience with the king. For a moment, he even wondered if he should be equally nervous. However, the time had come to go into that very room to her father and brother. As soon as the Count turned to face the guests, he immediately recognized Bianca. As he expected, she was an exact copy of her mother. Since the aristocrats had not seen each other for a long time, the Count, without unnecessary emotion, was the first to extend his hand and congratulate Zachary on his victory. At the time, his daughter was extremely surprised by such a greeting from her father. The man did not even ask how she was doing, although they had not seen each other for 10 years. Afterwards, Sir Blanchefort reported that he had heard of the Count and Countess's invitation to Princess Audrey's garden. This meant that the king valued his guests highly. When Bianca's father expressed his hope that Count Arno would continue to serve the country, the girl suddenly realized that he had come here not for her, but to meet Zachary. After all, there was essentially no need to be concerned about the safety of his daughter, whom he himself had once married off. It seemed the Count sought this meeting solely to strengthen political ties. At some point, the girl became so upset that she directly stated there's no point in her being here because her father is not interested in how she lives. Lady Arno couldn't hold back her tears. Did her father really not care how she'd lived all these years? How she'd grown up? What she'd felt? And how she'd survived Nanny Jenny's death? In the end, she couldn't stand it any longer and asked the Count directly if he even remembered that Bianca had once been his daughter. To further emphasize the distance, the girl addressed him in a very formal manner. She may have been a bit harsh, but her feelings were understandable. It was a pain she carried within herself for 10 years. And her father's cold reaction was the last straw that caused her nervous breakdown. Of course, the Count hadn't forgotten his daughter. On the contrary, he was delighted to learn that Bianca was living in prosperity and well-being. That is why he had no doubts when he left her in a strange castle. He was sure that everything would be fine with her. However, the girl emphasized that her father not only had no doubts, he did not even allow the thought of doubting. The lady exclaimed that, having become the Earl's wife, she had to remain in his domain and defend it until her last breath, although at that time she was only 9 years old. The guest continued to speak bitterly about how her father could so easily utter these words, and even declare that she had no right to return to her homeland under any circumstances. Bianca gave in to her emotions so much that she completely lost control of everything she said that day. It was especially painful for her that her husband, with whom she had not even had time to become truly close, had to listen to this storm of feelings. Realizing she had nothing more to say, the girl simply wanted to run away from everything that was happening. But as she headed for the exit, she tripped and, fortunately, fell right into her husband's arms. In fact, Zachary took everything he heard calmly. He saw himself in her, a man with nowhere to return to. Now it became clear why this fragile girl was so eager to give birth to an heir as soon as possible. She obviously wanted to be useful to Arno. Zachary also realized that she had spent the entire winter trying to adjust to her new life. She tried her best to prove her worth so that she wouldn't be rejected here, just as the Vigue clan had once rejected him. To support her, Zachary repeated what he had said before. No matter what she did, his attitude towards her would not change. He took her hand firmly and told her she didn't need to force herself to change. It was enough for him just to have Bianca by his side. The guy asked his wife to be herself and added that if she left now, she would not hear what her father wanted to say. With tears in his eyes, the father said that he now saw before him the spitting image of his wife. Bianca resembled her in both appearance and character. The Count always knew how difficult it was to resist his daughter's stubbornness. He remembered Bianca had once been a child who believed that tears, tantrums, and stubbornness could get her way, and he didn't want her to behave the same way in Arno. In fact, the man was afraid that if he didn't say these words, his daughter would never be able to grow up. Now the Count understood that his dear daughter did not need such severity at all. As for the letters, he didn't write them because he didn't want to show weakness. He was afraid that once he started writing, he wouldn't be able to resist and would call her back home. Now, Count Blanchefort could barely hold back his tears, regretting how he treated his only daughter, simply because he was afraid of his own feelings. Her father apologized, and in such a situation, Bianca could do nothing but listen to him. But besides the apologies, she still wanted to hear the main thing, that he missed her. And then she herself admitted that she missed him, and her brother too. Joachim couldn't bear it and rushed to hug his sister with tears in his eyes. He missed her no less. At that moment, Zachary remembered Bianca saying her brother took after their father. But looking at him now, he realized they really were alike. When Bianca tried to hold back her tears in front of others, she became an exact copy of her father. In the end, the entire Blanchefort family could not contain their emotions. They stood there for several more minutes, hugging each other tightly and crying. Zachary decided not to interfere with the family reunion, so he went out into the hallway. There he spotted his knights and the mistress's assistant, who were stealthily eavesdropping on the proceedings. A few minutes later, Bianca, now more cheerful, ran out of the room to hug her husband. Most of all, she wanted to thank Zachary for being there on such an important day for her. After this emotional family reunion, Counts Arnaud and Blanchefort began to see each other frequently. Count and Countess Arnaud regularly visited the Blanchefort residence and spent time dining together. And although relations with her family improved, Bianca faced a new, more serious problem. Zachary de Arnaud's face became cold and emotionless again. Riding in the carriage, the girl recalled how that day she called him dear and, thanking him, hugged him tightly. But despite her sincerity, the guy didn't look the least bit happy. Disturbing thoughts began to convince her that he was avoiding her. At some point, the heroine thought that she shouldn't have said those harsh words to her father, spoken out of emotion. And yet, something didn't add up. After that scene, Zachary himself comforted her and said that everything would be fine. That's why she dared to hug him. Now, Bianca was angry that in the end, it was she who felt guilty. She even thought it would have been better if she had limited herself to words. However, at that moment, the man himself was only thinking about how much Lady Arnaud's updo suited her. He could not take his eyes off his mistress, considering her the most beautiful girl in the world. Although the husband and wife were sitting next to everyone, their thoughts were completely different. When the young people returned to Blanchefort Castle to share a meal with Bianca's family, the Count decided to tell Zachary a few facts that he did not know. First of all, he mentioned that after Zachary received the title, the second prince wanted to win him over. Since most of the experienced nobles supported Gautier, he sought allies among new people. If you recall, at the first meeting in Loise, Zachary arrived there precisely at the invitation of the second prince, arrived a day earlier, and looked around the palace. And it was then, in the first prince's garden, that Bianca's father proposed to him to marry his daughter. Events then unfolded in such a way that Bianca became the wife of the Knight d'Arnaud. The very next day, the second prince suddenly canceled the meeting, probably after learning that Zachary had accepted Blanchefort's proposal. The Count was well aware that he had effectively crossed the prince by taking Zachary. This significantly worsened their relationship. Bianca's father also revealed that during their last meeting last winter, Jacob allowed himself to belittle both of them. Joachim added that he even ignored his greeting, and such an attitude towards the heir of the Blanchefort family was considered extremely impolite. The Count noted that after trying to prevent Arnaud from meeting with the second prince, he, on the contrary, showed an unexpected interest in Bianca. It was then that Mr. Blanchefort realized that his original plan would not work. After the second prince's visit, Bianca's childhood portrait disappeared from the living room. This was hardly a mere coincidence. This portrait always stood on the shelf, and the Count took it with him on his travels. Such an important object could not have disappeared without reason. The second prince's malice and greed seemed to know no bounds, so the Count decided that the young people should know about this act. Moreover, Jacob did not hide the fact that his spies were everywhere, so guests from Arnaud had to be especially careful in Loise. After dinner with her father, Bianca seriously thought about what she had heard. Now everything became clear. Knowing about the prince's interest, she clearly understood why his gaze made her want to leave as soon as possible. But another question arose. Was he truly so interested in her that he was willing to forgive her father for losing the Count's support? After all, Jacob didn't even know what Bianca really was like. Until the very end, the lady refused to believe that the second prince could have stolen her portrait. It seemed insane. Such thoughts even made her feel sick. Zachary, as a caring husband, could not stand to watch her condition worsen, so he suggested they take a little walk and get some fresh air. When they left, Gaspard brought Yvonne some of her favorite candies. The remaining ones decided to wait for the Count and Countess near the carriage. After the sun began to set, Yvonne, along with the girl's bodyguard, Sir Gaspard, enjoyed sweet candies that melted in their mouths while they waited for the Count and lady to return, not having the slightest idea what was happening to her. In the evening, the sun shone especially beautifully. Although the weather was already cool, Zachary was concerned that Lady Bianca was comfortable and warm. At such moments, the girl became increasingly surprised by her husband's behavior. He had ignored her for the last couple of days, and now, as if believing that a couple of caring phrases would fix everything, he was trying to behave differently. However, they suddenly met a strange man who was hiding his face behind a book. In another situation, the guy would have pretended not to notice him, but now that was impossible. His Excellency, the second prince, was greeting the guests of Arnaud's estate. How unexpected it was to see this narcissistic aristocrat here. But the unexpected encounters didn't end there. Right behind the young people stood another person. It turned out to be the Count's elder brother, Viscount Vieg, the very same young gentleman who expelled the Count from his homeland. Earlier, upon returning home, the boy noticed Vincent packing his things. The butler explained that he was acting on instructions from his older brother, Zachary. Viscount Vieg himself watched with a grin from the balcony as his brother's things were packed into boxes. Zachary was hurt and upset. His family member threw his things out on the street, and he himself was forced to go hunting because there was nothing left for him on the estate. Zachary, as a man of honor, could not calmly watch as the family, already exhausted by the death of his father, continued to fall apart. He tried to remind his brother that their father had been buried only 2 days ago, and yet he was already treating the person closest to him so cruelly. However, Vieg himself believed that 2 days were enough for Zachary. The elder brother always declared that the day he became Viscount Vieg, Zachary would be banished from here. Moreover, he rudely ordered Zachary to be grateful to Vincent, as if it were a sign of mercy. As a sign of respect for his father, the butler even asked for an extra day for his youngest son. Zachary was simply at a loss for words. He couldn't believe his own brother still hated him, but there was a reason for this hatred. The stepmother loved Vieg as if she were her own son, as if she had given birth to him herself. But when Zachary appeared, there was no one left in the estate who would sincerely support his older brother. That is why the Viscount had no reason left to treat Zachary with warmth. That day, the older brother actually ordered Zachary to go away and disappear from his sight. Fortunately, at least Zachary wasn't alone then. Vincent was by his side. Although the butler wasn't obligated to follow him, he believed the young man was destined to be a knight, not a priest, and that with his support, he would become stronger. Zachary couldn't hold back his tears. He knew that even with Vincent by his side, it would still be hard for him to return to his old life. He was prepared for them to starve, but Vincent continued to support him, trying to remain optimistic even in such a situation. Just as the Countess had once reunited with her family after 10 years, the Count met his after 13, and it happened in the most unexpected place. Still, being among other two-faced aristocrats was extremely unpleasant. It was then that Zachary had to introduce his wife, as Vieg had initially mistaken Bianca for his niece, and not for Countess Arno. Then, Viscount Vieg allowed himself a frankly offensive performance. He said that when his brother was a ram, this lady was allegedly sold from Blanchefort, like a thing, and it was thanks to her that he became a count. Vieg, who had driven his brother from his homeland, clearly harbored a deep resentment towards him, which was now reflected in Bianca. Because of this unpleasant aristocrat, dirty rumors began to spread about the girl, and hints of her intrigue with the minstrel became the cause of a serious blow to the reputation of Zachary d'Arnos. Zachary's older brother, a man named Roland de Vigu, was the one who had actually driven Bianca herself out of Arno's territory in the past. Vigu continued to tell His Highness interesting facts, including mentioning that when his brother married, the lady was only 9 years old, and with obvious condemnation, he spoke about how wrong this was. However, the second prince decided to calm the enraged Viscount, noting that he and his brother had not seen each other for many years. Immediately after this, Roland demonstratively apologized to His Highness, not wanting to appear too rude in his eyes. However, the second prince emphasized that the man should apologize to Bianca. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. The girl did not understand at all why Jacob so freely addressed her by name in front of the Count and the Viscount, and why he did it so calmly, as if they were really close. It looked like the second prince was deliberately creating the impression that they were a couple. At that moment, Zachary couldn't listen to a word his brother and his ally were saying. He took Bianca's hand and quietly asked her to close her eyes. He would take care of everything. It was becoming clear that the Count had been deliberately provoked. First the incident at Blanchefort, now this. It seemed someone was deliberately trying to humiliate him and paint him in a worse light next to his wife. However, Zachary acted like a reasonable person. He did not enter into a conflict, but simply picked up his wife in his arms and loudly announced that it was time for them to leave. He explained that Bianca had gone for a walk because of stomach problems, and in such cold, windy weather, her condition could only get worse. The heroine had absolutely no idea what he had in mind. He was already carrying her in his arms, just like when she had weakened during horseback riding lessons, but now everything was happening in front of her relatives and the second prince. Zachary added out loud that Bianca might have developed a fever and was starting to run a fever, so they needed to get back immediately. Before leaving, he apologized to His Highness and again emphasized that his wife was in poor health, so he was afraid that she might catch a cold. Of course, the second prince took this behavior as a sign of disrespect, believing that he dared to leave without His Highness's permission. Without thinking, Jacob stopped them and grabbed Bianca's wrist. Then, with permission, he kissed her hand, his gaze lingering on her slender fingers. He had no intention of stopping. After kissing her hand, the prince promised to give Bianca a valuable gift because their meeting seemed fateful to him. He continued to insist that it was all fate, because such meetings do not happen every day. Jacob claimed that their meetings were God's providence, and asked her not to worry, promising to send medicine for women's health to her estate. He also noted that the girl had looked unwell since her arrival in Laos, and this troubled his heart. Zachary could no longer silently tolerate these statements. At that moment, he made it clear that everything his wife consumed had to be approved by him, from olives to tea. Zachary again thanked him for his concern, but noted that his wife had not touched any of the packages from the second prince. The fact that the husband controls everything his wife eats only made Jacob laugh. He laughed even harder, realizing that someday he would gain the same control over her. While Zachary carried his wife in his arms, Many passers-by watched the gentleman's actions with surprise. However, the girl was extremely embarrassed and asked to be put down. Although he had carried her in his arms before, the situation now felt different. They were in an unfamiliar place and in front of strangers. Zachary had no intention of putting Bianca down and merely suggested that she pretend to have lost consciousness so as not to attract unnecessary attention. He asked Miss Arno to simply close her eyes and trust him. He would figure it all out. These words made it clear that Bianca had become someone truly important to him, and she herself liked it. At first, she only pretended to be asleep, but by the end of the journey, she really fell asleep. So the young man had to carry her straight to the bed. As he left, he again remembered how the second prince had touched her hand and kissed it. He couldn't remember exactly which hand Jacob had touched, the right or the left, so that night he mentally checked both of his mistress's hands. That same night, the count summoned 3 knights at once. The guards quickly realized that the reason for this sudden gathering was the prince, who was too openly showing interest in a married woman. Monsieur d'Arnaud tried to justify the young man's behavior by suggesting that perhaps Jacob was trying to provoke Zachary and Count Blanchefort. But regardless of the true reasons, one thing was clear. The second prince was indeed looking at Bianca in a very strange and intent way. The young man decided to give Gaspard an order. If Bianca and the second prince collided, the knight was to immediately take the countess away. At that moment, Sauveur thought out loud that my lord might have ordered Gaspard to accompany the countess precisely because he feared that such a clash might actually occur. Initially, one of the knights thought that Zachary had gone too far with this, but now he was genuinely surprised at how everything turned out in reality. In fact, if Zachary had had the slightest doubt, he would not have brought his wife to Laos. Now, the hero knew only one thing. Bianca would definitely be pursued, so the bodyguard should be on guard. But we must not forget about the symbolism. Zachary d'Arnaud is called the Fierce Wolf, and Arnaud's symbol is a black wolf. The wolf is ready to bite anyone who dares to encroach on his property. No one will ever take Bianca from Zachary. The knight will be prepared to take even extreme measures against anyone who dares. Bianca is priceless to him now. The next morning, a doctor came to Miss Arnaud's room. Yvonne told the doctor that this was the second time the countess had returned from Loise in such a state. The doctor advised that when the girl feels better, she should do light exercises and also increase the amount of food she consumes. As soon as the heroine opened her eyes, the first thing she did was ask where the count was. Her assistant informed her that Zachary had gone to breakfast that morning with His Highness Gautier. The count's actions were entirely expected. When the husband and wife were in Loise, my lord was with her all the time, and there was practically no time left for anything else. However, at that very moment, Yvonne shared that the count was going to decline the invitation in order to personally take care of his wife. But it would have been impolite to decline the crown prince's invitation, so everyone actively tried to dissuade Zachary, and he said that he would return immediately after the meal. Now, the lady's personal assistant did not understand at all how this had happened to her health, because in Arno, the girl had been horse riding and had eaten well. If the heroine had known how much this would affect her well-being, she would have taken her horse and Isabel with her. However, even simple walks could be considered beneficial exercise. The assistant nevertheless decided that the lady needed to rest first and foremost now, and that they would begin their walks later when the lady felt better. Lately, the countess has indeed gotten a little stronger. On the doctor's recommendations, she began to eat more and go for walks more often. One day, as she was getting ready to go out, the girl looked at her pendant, which she had decided to take with her on the trip. She asked her assistant to create makeup to complement the jewelry. The pendant was very precious to Miss Arno. It had been a gift from the count for her 15th birthday. At that moment, still a child, she received such a gift from him for the first time, and the shade of the stone matched the color of her eyes. A few minutes later, the girl was already collected and dressed in her best clothes, but she was still a little worried because she knew that she could run into Viscount Vigue or Jacob. But these young men couldn't relax either. With such an accompaniment in the form of 2 strong knights and a personal assistant, they couldn't just approach Bianca. That day, Bianca went for a walk in the first princess's garden and spent time in Sauveur's company more calmly than usual. During the walk, Sauveur told the countess that he was sincerely glad of her presence in their lives. He believed that the girl in Arno had become a kind of center of everyone's attention, in a good way. At that moment, the young people accidentally overheard the conversation of other aristocrats who were also walking in the first princess's garden. They met by chance at a turn, and the local aristocrats decided that it was the guests who should give way. One of the young ladies introduced Countess d'Aveville, a relative of the prince. Her friend believed that everyone should give way to this countess. However, Sauveur decided to intervene in the conversation between the 2 ladies, declaring that, although he was not a local, such behavior was pure ignorance. The situation was getting tense. One of the girls had already started raising her voice, again claiming that the countess herself was standing in front of them. However, what was her surprise when she was informed that a countess named Bianca d'Arnaud was also present? In fact, Jacob and Vigue are not the only ones who cause her trouble. Bianca has long forgotten about people who compete with each other for status and fame. At the same time, the more embittered girl was extremely dissatisfied with the appearance of Countess Arnaud, believing that she was too arrogant for her age. In addition, the noblewoman did not like Bianca's physique. She thought the girl was too thin and lacked the necessary elegance. The cheeky woman also noticed the girl's pendant and asked why it was that particular color. The pendant's value was obvious. It was not just a gift from the count, but also a jewel with one of the highest quality stones. for which pearls of the highest quality were specially selected. To avoid further argument, Bianca apologized and said she wasn't feeling well. She wished the ladies a good walk and left. As he left the scene of the conflict, Sover noticed that one of the women seemed familiar to him. He was sure he had seen her among the maids. In fact, among those girls there really was a certain miss, whom the protagonist of this story had encountered before. You never know who you might meet along the way. A little later, during tea, the girls continued to discuss Countess Arno, with whom they had unexpectedly crossed paths. They believed the lady had behaved too haughtily. Someone even expressed the opinion that her character is explained by the fact that her husband is a national hero. The girls did not forget to discuss Mrs. Appearance. She was wearing a very luxurious dress, and they did not understand why she chose such an ornate decoration instead of a simpler one. Only Countess de Vauville did not want to participate in the condemnation of Bianca. On the contrary, she thought that the decoration was beautiful and suited her perfectly. While the girls were actively discussing the Countess in a negative light, a simple servant unexpectedly joined them. She intervened in the conversation and declared that she had previously worked for Count Arno and knew stories that might interest the noblewomen. Although such behavior was disrespectful, female curiosity got the better of them, and the girls decided to ask the maid what exactly she was going to tell them. The same maid Ante, who had left Arno's house just a couple of months ago, spoke before the aristocrats. Meanwhile, while Bianca was sitting at a picnic with her bodyguards and assistant, Sovor suddenly remembered who exactly he had met a few minutes ago. It turned out that Bianca had almost forgotten how she had kicked that very maid out of the castle for disrespecting the Countess. However, she remembered everything when Yvonne reminded her of how the assistant had cared for her hands in the past. Such moments were difficult for a lady to forget. Now Bianca behaved with dignity and did not discuss this impudent girl, only noting that Ante was extremely lucky to have found herself a servant to a noblewoman so quickly. However, the conversation didn't last long. It was time to go back. The seamstress was supposed to arrive after dinner to fit the Count's clothes. But before the boys left, Sovor decided to discuss with the mistress's personal assistant whether Ante could have held a grudge against the mistress and spread strange rumors. After all, this girl had been kicked out precisely because of her inability to watch her mouth. Now, he couldn't relax completely, because he was sure that if this ill-mannered person had done it once, she could do it again. Upon returning to the palace, Bianca's first order of business was to visit her husband. The tailor had arrived early, so Zachary's measurements had already been taken. As soon as Mr. Arno saw his wife, he was pleasantly surprised and immediately noticed that she was wearing that very necklace. Initially, the Count thought that the girl did not wear it because she did not like it, but Bianca explained that this was not at all the case. He then added that he bought the piece of jewelry because its shade matched the color of Bianca's eyes. At that moment, the man was so captivated by her that he couldn't contain his desire. He moved closer to her ear and quietly whispered how incredible she looked today. After this, the lady gently said goodbye to him and said that she would go change into more comfortable clothes and would return soon to choose outfits with her husband. As soon as the hero let go of his ladylove, he immediately asked the bodyguards if they had seen Bianca with the second prince. Gaspar reported that Jacob had not crossed paths with them, but there was one detail. The same woman had run into Bianca in the garden. Sovor immediately tried to calm the knight, explaining that the Countess most likely did not even notice this girl and hardly remembered her at all. Since Zachary was a rather reserved partner, he, having heard this whole story, nevertheless drew attention to the fact that Bianca trusted this particular knight and started a conversation about the young man's new outfit. And when Mr. d'Arno learned that his wife had given Count Sovor's old clothes, he almost fell into a stupor of jealousy. The hero was so afraid that Bianca might get close to this knight that he immediately asked Sovor to immediately take off the stranger's clothes. In the next room, Bianca was getting ready to go out and heard the men arguing loudly. At times like these, she felt she needed to keep a close eye on her husband, and Sovor was too noisy. To ease the tension, Yvonne suggested that Sovor might be like that because of his background. He grew up a commoner and was used to speaking frankly, without reserve. However, the girl herself did not dwell on this, and above all, was glad that she now had such a reliable personal assistant next to her. Next to Yvonne, she felt calmer. At the same time, Bianca wasn't sure she even understood what happiness was. Having returned to her 18 years, she felt like she was living her life all over again and was only trying to correct past mistakes. She knew what future awaited her, and that happiness wasn't included. But now the lady increasingly realized that this life wasn't just her own. The reborn Miss Arno gradually began to realize that everyone around her had their own destiny and their own life, and each of these lives is important. Now the heroine sincerely wished for all her loved ones and those around her to find happiness. But no one would believe that Lydia had gone back in time, so she wasn't sure if the Count would believe her if she told him that Jacob was a traitor. Although the invasion is still ongoing, Bianca's relationship with the Count is different from her past experience. If the past changes, then the future can change too. Perhaps if Bianca gets even closer to the Count, he'll believe her words. Now she needs to be careful not to miss this opportunity. After the beauty had gotten ready, she clarified that she was ordering clothes specifically for the Count. However, Yvonne explained that she had been unable to find a suitable cloak for the tournament, so she suggested the lady get a new one. Only then did Bianca learn that she would have to attend the night's tournament to bolster the participants' spirits. Moreover, this time, House Arno would have 4 competitors competing. The tournament is attended by Sovor, Gaspar, Robert, and His Excellency Count Zachary. A tournament is a competition between knights on horseback. They are armed with lances and attack each other, and the one who remains on his feet until the end is considered the winner. In such a dangerous competition, victory is considered a great honor. The winner of the final round will receive a golden, eternal rose that never fades, and he will give this flower to his beloved. This is precisely the special charm of the tournament. However, Bianca didn't need any romance in this life. After her return to the past, much had changed. This change of events meant that the Count's death could occur for a completely different reason. Now, the girl was very afraid that the young man might die not in captivity a few years later, but right at this tournament, if he accidentally fell or made a mistake. That's why the heroine rushed to Zachary to ask him not to participate in this tournament. She tried to dissuade him from the duel, saying that she had heard of cases of fatalities when knights did not have time to dodge or fell awkwardly from their horses. At that moment, Bianca noticed how much anxiety she was experiencing, but decided to explain it only by the absence of an heir. The heroine understood that if there was even the slightest risk of an unsuccessful outcome, she must do everything to stop the Count. Then Sauveur decided to intervene in the conversation. He noted that the tournament was being held in honor of the Crown Prince's betrothal, so participation was open to many knights. The young man added that all participants had undergone a rigorous selection process, meaning there should be no accidents. Besides, he said, it was far more appropriate to worry about the Count's opponents. Anyone who dared to challenge him should be prepared for a quick death. But the moment Bianca began arguing with Sauveur about how senselessly the knights were risking their lives, Zachary realized that his wife was worried about more than just him. She also chided her husband for not mentioning the tournament earlier. Of course, she had promised to come, since it was related to her husband, but she hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly. However, Zachary himself was only thinking about whether Bianca was really worried about him. He didn't know for sure if her feelings were sincere, but he wanted to believe that they were. At the same time, he still convinced himself that Bianca simply couldn't stand the smell of blood, and that was the whole problem, and not her concern for him. He then said out loud that he understood her concerns, and that she should not force herself to visit places where there were many injured people. These words sounded painful for Bianca. She was worried specifically about the Count, but it seemed that he did not need her concerns. At least, that's what it seemed to her. Afterwards, she responded that people would still notice if she didn't show up at a tournament where her husband was participating. She didn't want his reputation to suffer because of it. Finally, the girl added that someone would definitely be hurt, and there was no guarantee that this someone would not be her husband. However, the man was also worried. He was afraid that the lady might lose consciousness on the spot, and he did not want to expose his wife to such danger. From the outside, listening to the argument between these two spouses was simply unbearable. It was as if they didn't hear each other. The girl didn't understand her man, and he didn't understand her. At one point, Bianca thought he was trying to imply that there was no point in her interfering. Then the Countess flared up and declared that he could do as he pleased, but she would do the same. After this, Lady Arno asked her assistant to call the tailor to order new clothes for the Count and a coat for herself. The man sat down next to her and calmly confirmed that this would be sufficient. Even Sauveur was laughing now, remembering the atmosphere of that day. It was as if everyone had been doused with a bucket of ice water. For some reason, these two did not notice that they were both worried about each other, although Sauveur saw it perfectly well. When Robert learned of the Countess's reaction, he was shocked. When my lord left for war, the lady didn't even blink, but now she was worried about the tournament. Sauveur, on the contrary, admitted that Milady was right. Even if the tournament looked like a spectacle, the essence did not change. People risked their lives for entertainment. Robert even thought that he could use the situation as an excuse to refuse to participate, since no one capable of defeating Zachary had yet been born in Severn. He also noted that the Knights of Castile would also be participating in the tournament, so Zachary was obliged to take part. However, the real reason was different. If the Count won, the Countess would have to come and congratulate him in person. And now, Zachary understood that participating in the tournament could only work to his advantage. The man was sure that all these gnats that were always buzzing around Bianca would get into trouble. Jacob and that maid won't be able to sleep peacefully now. The Count will still remind them of a lot, and these two will not get close to Zachary's wife. He knew that the blood in his veins flowed to protect Bianca, and he wanted everyone to remember that once and for all. However, the Countess was unaware of his intentions, and therefore continued to avoid him, citing poor health. Even when Bianca's personal assistant tried to enter the room, the girl did not answer the maid, pretending to be asleep, just so as not to be disturbed. Time flew by. There was only one day left until the tournament. That evening, Yvonne tried to reach Bianca again, but was told that the lady was already asleep. For a moment, Zachary doubted Bianca would be able to make it to the tournament, as she had started going to bed so early. However, Yvonne explained that the Countess had already ordered a coat, especially for the event, so she would definitely show up. The assistant also added that the mistress took regular walks, ate well, and tried to maintain her strength so she could come and support her husband. Zachary believed the maid, but still asked Yvonne not to let Bianca in if she was tired. That same evening, Yvonne suddenly felt very attracted to her bodyguard and decided not to miss the chance. She told him that she would be rooting for him at the tournament. That night, Bianca couldn't sleep at all, so she amused herself by weaving lace. But the girl's thoughts were occupied only with the next day. Bianca remembered that many ladies would come to support the participants, and if the Count entered the tournament wearing a headscarf the Countess herself had designed, that would be the best outcome. Now, the main character of the story did everything in her power, just like Zachary d'Arnaud. However, the lady was still troubled by heavy thoughts that night. The words that he did not need her worries again reminded her of the past. Before, young people were so far from each other. Now, Bianca was so immersed in her own thoughts that she had already begun to assume perhaps the Count's tenderness in the last 6 months meant nothing. The lady had long noticed that this man had always been an extremely responsible person, and now it seemed to her that her own actions had only strengthened his sense of duty. He repeated time and again that a lady is not obliged to do what she does not want, while remaining the same reserved and straightforward person. But what about Miss Arnaud herself? The feelings she experienced with every touch were already familiar to her. She had experienced something similar in relation to Fernand in her past life. Now the lady understood she was doing wrong by returning to these memories. These were far from pleasant images: pain, betrayal, despair, condemnation, pleading, and loneliness. This feeling was like an illness that slowly makes you suffer and eventually exhausts you to the limit. And this is what they call love. So now the lady convinced herself that she was really lucky. After all, there was still a distance between her and her husband. Now Bianca was sure that she had seen into this man's soul, even before she had time to fall in love even more deeply. The day of the night's tournament arrived. The atmosphere was reminiscent of a grand spring festival. Not only nobles, but also commoners participated in the competition. It was also a chance to see the Princess of Castile, as well as her groom in attendance. However, the main topic of discussion at the tournament remained bets on which warrior would win. Everyone around was discussing and was sure that the main and most fierce warrior would be Count d'Arnaud. Most of the bets for second place were placed on the Knights of Arnaud, Sir Gaspar, Sir Robert, and Sir Sauveur. Some also speculated that the second prince could rise to the ranks of the tournament's strongest warriors. But Bianca's greatest worry now was something else: that this ill-mannered man might ruin the Count's saddle, or, for example, damage someone else's weapon. Bianca's presence here seemed like a mere formality, and she even thought that such a talented man as the Count would not die such a senseless death. She pondered the possibility that the second prince, Jacob, was probably secretly corresponding with Aragon, and that the others were unaware of it. Then she remembered that the Count had died in battle with Aragon, and she couldn't help but wonder if this had been Jacob's plan. But the lady was distracted from her thoughts by a loud musical sound coming from the side. The noise was so loud that she couldn't concentrate, and turning around, decided to look at the musician. However, when she turned around, the girl completely unexpectedly saw the familiar silhouette of a man. It was Fernand, standing before her. Fernand was a very handsome and attractive man. The character's voice was as beautiful as his appearance. This young man came to the tournament in Laos to find himself a lady or madame as a patroness. He, like a peacock, attracted the attention of many ladies, but his gaze was directed towards the beauty of one and only one, our beautiful lady. The girl did not want to meet this man, whom she already knew from a past life, so she turned away abruptly as soon as she saw his silhouette. However, this gesture only attracted the man even more. It seemed to him that the girl had met the gaze of such an attractive man as he, and had simply become embarrassed. In his eyes, Bianca looked like a young and innocent lady who didn't know what to do with herself. But the main character was in no mood for jokes. She couldn't even imagine that she would run into this man here. For a second, Bianca even thought that the second prince might have planned this meeting, but she immediately dismissed the thought. In a past life, it would have made sense, but in this one, it would have seemed complete nonsense. After this, Fernand began to openly flirt with the aristocrat, telling her about love at first sight. Bianca was so reluctant to talk to him that she decided to leave immediately. She took her assistant by the arm and loudly said that she needed to see her husband. However, the fact that the stranger turned out to be not just a lady, but a married woman, only further provoked him. After all, in his opinion, the more inaccessible the goal, the stronger the desire to get it. Fernand really irritated Bianca, and she couldn't understand how he could allow himself to flirt like that, considering she was married. Now, the girl didn't even understand how she could have loved this frivolous man in her past life. But there was no point in thinking about that now. The lady headed to the tents where the knights were preparing to present the gift to her husband. That morning, Bianca wanted to give the Count a handkerchief and wish him luck, but she couldn't do it because she hadn't slept all night. She thought that if the knight appeared at the tournament with her handkerchief, it might draw attention to the lace. But still, she made it especially for the Count and wanted to present it personally. At that moment, she met the knights. Sauveur was glad to see the lady, deciding that she had come to support them. He noted that there were many loyal supporters among the Knights of the Guard, so Sauveur and even Robert promised that if they won, they would definitely give the rose to Lady Arnaud, like true knights. And Bianca herself had no reason to refuse the gift of her assistance. She would have gladly accepted a rose from a brave knight. But now, the heroine had to gather her courage. No matter what the Count thought of her, she had to go to him. When the girl entered the tent, she saw her knight. In armor, he looked truly majestic and beautiful. After realizing her feelings, every action of the Count seemed even more significant and correct to Bianca. She was deeply in love with him. For a moment, the lady thought she should not have entered. She thought the Count did not look happy. However, the miss finally pulled herself together and said that she had brought the lace for her husband. She handed him a piece of cloth, hoping he would return safe and sound. The gesture delighted the man. He was so overjoyed, he didn't even know what to do. After this, the gentleman dropped to one knee and admitted that, following his vow to his family, he would dedicate his victory to his wife. The girl tied a lace bow on his hand, blessed him for victory and glory, and then kissed the cloth. The preparations were already completed, and at the end, the Count hugged her tightly, promising to return. Now, the main character could only pray to God that he would not deprive the Arno family of their support, a master who stood firmly on his feet. She understood that their castle still needed a hero who could defend Sevran from Aragon's attack. And to be honest, Bianca needed the Count no less, so now she sincerely prayed for him to return safe and sound. The ceremonial signal sounded, announcing the start of the duel. The Master of Ceremonies introduced the distinguished guests of the event, Victor de Sevran, grandson of the King of Sevran, and Sir Albert, son of Gautier de Sevran. Among those present was also the king's daughter, Garcia of Castilla. Today, these distinguished guests were celebrating their engagement. While the first knight who would enter the competition was being announced, the main character of this story noticed Fernand flirting with some unknown lady. At that moment, the lady's assistant noted that the second prince was nowhere to be seen. In the stands, to the left of the king, sat the first Prince Gautier, and to his right, Princess Audrey. She was extraordinarily beautiful. Her neat golden curls and blue eyes immediately attracted attention. But Bianca didn't have time to get a good look at the princess. The duel suddenly began. One of the knights was brutally attacked from behind, and the sight was far from pleasant. After his victory, the knight presented his beloved with a rose, as was customary. However, at that moment, Bianca couldn't understand how the girl could smile so calmly. She thought that her own lover was risking his life, and this lady didn't seem to be worried at all. Imagine Bianca's surprise when the next participant was announced. He turned out to be the son of Count Gustave de Blanchefort, a descendant of Hogemonia, riding a unicorn, Sir Joachim de Blanchefort. He immediately made eye contact with his sister and waved to her in greeting. Although the girl herself was not happy about this meeting, it had originally been agreed that only experienced knights would participate in the competition. The Blanchefort family was famous for producing many outstanding warriors. However, Count Blanchefort himself was much more drawn to the art of riding. His son, Sir Joachim, was the same. The lady believed that her brother might not be able to withstand participation in the tournament. Now, the lady had strong doubts about her brother's skills, and clearly understood that Joachim was in danger. The girl simply couldn't look at him calmly, so she turned away at the most cruel and tense moments. However, it was all over quickly. When the lady turned around again to find out the outcome of the fight, to her relief, Sir Joachim had emerged victorious. After winning, the brother, like a true gentleman, decided to give his rose to his sister. At that moment, the heroine felt the very tension that was squeezing her heart, but it instantly disappeared when the rose first appeared in her hands. Joachim's cold gaze was filled with confidence and satisfaction from the victory. The guy risked his life to receive the highest award, and of course, did not hide his joy. Next to enter the ring was Sovor, who easily dealt with his opponent and won, after which he presented the promised rose to the lady. Following him, the second knight of the guard, Robert, also won. The shy young man also decided to give his rose to Madame Arno. The lady noticed his nervousness and knew she shouldn't refuse the gift, lest she embarrass him even more. She congratulated the young man and said she would be delighted to see him achieve his future victories. Sir Gaspar was next to enter the fight of his life. As soon as it was the mistress's personal bodyguard's turn, Yvonne began to worry deeply about him. However, Bianca herself was hardly worried. This brave knight had already won victories more than once. And indeed, this time, Gaspard won the duel again. After the fight, he headed to where his mistress was seated to present her with a rose. But this rose was dedicated not to Bianca, but to her assistant, Yvonne. The maid was indescribably happy to accept the rose from the brave knight. However, while Bianca was rejoicing for her assistant, she didn't notice Fernand approaching her. He began asking the lady if her husband was among the knights who had already presented flowers. Now, the heroine had no desire to talk to this man, especially since the next duel promised to be one of the most interesting. The strongest candidates were entering the arena. The next duel was to feature the son of His Majesty, King Victor de Sevran, Jacob de Sevran. However, no one yet knew who his opponent would be. If Jacob lost, it could affect the king's honor. Even Fernand understood that the second prince's opponent had likely chosen to withdraw from the duel. And so it happened. The young man, unknown to him, withdrew, and the fight ended in a technical victory. However, immediately after the victory, the second prince did not go to Madame Arno. Instead, he approached her and persistently held out a rose, asking her to accept the gift. Too many people were looking at them now, and refusal could cause unnecessary rumors. And although Bianca did not want to accept anything from the second prince's hands, until the very end, she had to take the rose so as not to damage her reputation. Fernand watched this scene closely. He knew the prince had recently shown no interest in women, but he considered it highly improper to show attention to a married woman. At first, Fernand thought that she was an ordinary young aristocrat, but now he noticed that the girl seemed to be constantly attracting attention and interest. It wasn't hard to guess how dangerous her husband was, since the second prince himself was showing interest in her. And this only further piqued Fernand's curiosity. It seemed like a whole line of people was forming around Bianca. Meanwhile, a certain dangerous husband watched closely as Fernand forced himself on Bianca. It was then that Zachary heard rumors about the girl, and how even the prince had supposedly given her a rose. The ladies whispered about who this girl was, and went psyched about her. Even Zachary couldn't stand listening to these vile comments about Miss Arno, and didn't understand why Bianca had to endure such words. But the lady only came here to support the count, and those who knew her character would not believe these evil rumors. The lady tried to ignore people who could only whisper behind her back. Now, some aristocrats were trying to damage her reputation. But the heroine still maintained a restrained demeanor. She had already learned from her past life experiences that gossip shouldn't control her state of mind. If she perceived it as noise, she could simply move on with her life. However, if Bianca had known how far these rumors would spread, she might have asked Gaspard to take Yvonne with him. After all, right now the assistant was most worried about her mistress. Fernand also did not want to listen to negative comments about the beauty, so he decided to cover up them with music, trying to turn all the attention into admiration for Bianca. However, the lady calmly replied that she was not interested in songs, especially since her husband would soon be released, and asked Fernand to leave her alone. But the persistent young man continued to act in his own way, and even invited Bianca to take his hand and pray together for her husband's victory. When Fernand extended his hand, the girl noticed that there was not a single callus on his hands, which played the lute, which indicated that he was not familiar with hard work. If you compare his hands with the Count's, the difference was obvious. Zachary's were rough, but reliable and warm, not at all like this young man's. Thoughts of her husband lifted Mrs. Spirits a little, and she calmly moved away from Fernand, informing him that the right to touch her hands belonged only to her husband. After these words, Fernand began to understand the true reason why the second prince was showing interest in the girl. Madame de Arnaud seemed to attract other people's desires and ambitions. Fernand was eagerly awaiting the appearance of the husband of the girl sitting next to him, and how surprised he was when, before the start of the fight, he noticed the coat of arms that was hung in the arena. The duel opened with the wolf, a war sword that mercilessly rips out the throat of anyone who dares to disgrace its wielder. Severin's hero, the cold-blooded Count Zachary de Arnaud, entered the arena. After the announcement of her husband's name, Bianca, with pride and slight excitement, confirmed that her husband was the very same Zachary de Arnaud, whose strength and name have long inspired respect and awe in high circles. The final competition was to be a true battle of the strongest and best knights, where not only victory, but also the honor of each participant would be decided. Now nothing could be heard on the site, except the loud clatter of hooves and the heavy snorting of horses, creating a tense, almost tangible atmosphere of anticipation. The lady sat with restraint and straightness, carefully watching what was happening, not allowing herself to be distracted from the duel for a second, and internally supporting her husband. The main character of this story forced herself to maintain an outward calm, because it was important for her to monitor the well-being of the Count and his condition on the battlefield until the end. Just a few minutes later, Zachary de Arnaud delivered the decisive blow to his powerful opponent, finishing the fight with the precision and confidence expected of him. Sir Zachary de Arnaud was officially declared the winner of the contest, and his name rang out over the arena as a final confirmation of strength and superiority. How pleasant it was for Bianca to realize that her man had won again, and that she had witnessed his triumph with her own eyes. The winner himself was no less pleased to see that the girl was genuinely worried about him. From her reddened eyes and intense gaze, it was obvious that she was barely holding back tears of excitement. While Zachary was busy with the public attention and official ceremonies, Bianca continued to quietly worry about him, never letting his image and condition out of her thoughts. However, that same day, during the rose presentation, Zachary told Bianca that he felt it was right to take a break from fighting for a while because too many prying eyes and people around her were making it difficult for him to concentrate. Either way, Zachary was expected to win, so he asked Miss to only come on the final day to avoid unnecessary attention and keep his thoughts clear. The Count's wife decided to obey her husband and did as he said, trusting his decision and accepting his concern for her safety and their peace of mind. On the second and third days of the tournament, the lady calmly occupied herself with weaving exquisite lace, trying to maintain her usual rhythm of life, despite the anxiety that still lived somewhere deep within her. She sat in her room, teaching her assistant this delicate craft. Bianca wanted to create a special gift for Her Highness Audrey and the Prince's First Lady, pouring precision and attention to every detail into her work. However, inside, she was still uneasy. No matter how hard she tried to maintain external balance, living constantly seeing her husband off on the battlefield and not knowing the outcome of each battle turned out to be much harder than she expected. At that moment, Sauveur suddenly entered the lady's room with not the most joyful news. Visibly tense and agitated, he reported that something truly important had happened at today's competition. The second day of the tournament was the qualifying stage, and the third was considered the final day of decisive matches, where the strongest of the remaining participants were determined. That day, Count Zachary de Arnaud did not spare even the young Blanchefort and won a decisive victory over his wife's brother, demonstrating his complete superior strength. Sauveur was genuinely surprised by Joachim's courage, and Robert added that he fought with all his might against the Count, without retreating a single step, despite the difference in experience and strength. Robert understood perfectly well that although Joachim was still young and inexperienced, with each fight against stronger opponents, he was gradually becoming better and more confident in his own abilities. At that moment, one of the knights reminded Robert that his opponent in the third battle would be the second prince. Jacob had advanced through the tournament bracket without a fight, so he looked especially confident and even defiantly energetic. Sauveur understood how great the risks were for Robert, and therefore suggested that his friend refuse the fight, believing that after the tournament, no one would dare openly challenge the second prince anyway. However, Robert had no intention of giving in. The young man refused to allow this insolent man to mock Madame Arnaud and wanted to put all his strength, will, and pent-up anger into the duel. Sauveur was genuinely surprised by his colleague's attitude, understanding his indignation at the insults directed at the Arnaud household, but still realizing that this was not a real war, but a demonstration competition. If this were a real war, Robert would not have been able to raise a sword against the second prince, for they were on the same side and bound by a common oath in service. And yet, despite the format of the tournament, Sauveur supported Robert and rooted for him. That day, Robert fought the second prince and was seriously wounded despite fierce resistance. Later, when Sauveur came to the ladies' room, he told Bianca that Robert, despite everything, held out until the very end. How strong must a person be to continue fighting in such conditions? The doctor said that Robert should not even think about returning to arms for now. If it had been anyone else, this might not have mattered, but Robert was a knight, and for him, this was extremely important. Even though his bones remained intact, the other knights were seriously worried about him. At that moment, the lady's personal assistant asked Sauveur how the other competitors were doing. It turned out that Sir Gaspard had placed fourth. Aside from the Count, he was one of the most skilled riders. Victory was, of course, predicted for the Count, but Sauveur heard that all three of the strongest were vying for second place, and among them, Gaspard was considered the leading candidate. As for Sauveur himself, he honestly admitted his defeat. He had a worthy and very strong opponent, the enormous Knight of Castia, so the defeat did not seem shameful to him. Castia is a country with a strong navy, and frankly, Sauveur didn't feel like his opponent was underestimating Arnaud. The Night Guard's authority was fully justified. The opponent proved to be as strong as a rock. He couldn't be easily brought down. In any case, everything worked out as it did. On the last day of the tournament, Sauveur was supposed to guard the mistress. And although he had eased the tension a little, the lady still couldn't stop thinking that Robert was trying to protect the honor of the Arnaud family rather than her own. Now the girl was experiencing mixed feelings, anger and shame, like internal wounds from the awareness of someone's sacrifice and the unwillingness to give in to the enemy. She remembered Robert's words that, although Her Highness Audrey was considered the most noble in Louise, the knight still considered it natural to give the rose to Bianca as his mistress. However, for Bianca, as the hostess, this defeat could not be annoying. That night, the Countess slept very lightly and restlessly. She had a nightmare and woke up in fear, realizing that the sun had already risen long ago. The day X has arrived, the final day of the knight's tournament. The beauty's eyes had been red since the morning. The lady was worried that she was never able to see the Count after this dream. Meanwhile, Zachary himself was preparing for the final exit, and Robert acted as his assistant today. At that moment, an unpleasant acquaintance approached the young man. Second Prince Jacob decided to get Zachary into a good mood before the duel. Jacob reminded him that Sir Robert had contested the championship yesterday, and now, seeing him defeated, he could not hide his disdain for the loser. However, Robert calmly replied that it did not matter to him in what capacity he was used, whether as a servant or a knight. He made it clear that the very opportunity to serve the Count was an honor for him. In response, the second prince remarked that he was too good at talking for a knight, and even added sarcastically that he would have made a better street poet or merchant than a warrior. However, Sauveur, who was standing nearby, asked Robert not to react and not to take the prince's words to heart. Zachary, as an experienced warrior, understood perfectly well that His Highness had come only to provoke him before the battle. At the same time, Jacob noted that on the third day, Bianca was not visible among the spectators, but today she is still watching the fights. The second prince emphasized that after this competition, only one of them would be able to give Bianca the rose, but Zachary firmly stated that he would be the one to make this gesture. To put the prince in his place, Count Arnaud sharply demanded that he not pronounce Bianca's name so familiarly. Then, Jacob did not lose his composure, and noticed that the Count was being too straightforward, after which he changed the conversation to the fact that he was interested in the growing popularity of courtly love. His Highness reasoned that emotional exchange, not with a spouse, but with another man, could be a useful experience for a noblewoman, just as an experience with another woman could be for a man. Jacob was openly trying to hint that the Count probably had a similar experience, as if he had once compared every aristocrat to Bianca. However, Zachary did not give in to provocations. He calmly and confidently told His Highness that he did not compare his wife with others, and did not give anyone a single chance next to her. Moreover, Mr. Arnaud added that he does not consider everyone around him to be equal in character and decency to the second prince. Zachary was so intolerant of Jacob's presence that he even took a step closer to express his disdain directly. He was like a wolf, the one that bites into the enemy's throat and doesn't let go until the end. It was useless to provoke such a man. The aristocrat understood this perfectly well, and yet continued. However, the second prince noted that even Zachary remains human, which means that in a moment of strong emotion, he can make a mistake. Jacob was sure that if he only found the Count's weak spot, the situation would turn in his favor. But no matter how hard His Highness tried, Zachary did not succumb to cheap manipulation and was focused on only one thing: victory. Jacob didn't back down either, openly calling the Count irritating and provocative. Lord Arnaud was annoyed that he had allowed the second prince to upset him. However, it now became clear to him why His Majesty favored the first prince more. Jacob, too, easily disrupted the peace by interfering in personal matters. Now Zachary was extremely irritated by the whole conversation with the impudent prince. At that moment, Jacob realized that Zachary d'Arnaud was like a living weapon, and it would be extremely difficult to defeat him. But even knowing this, he would still like to give the rose to Bianca if he had the chance. He didn't even care that the girl might look at the second prince with disdain. The young man believed that this was just the price for the opportunity to be near the beauty. Thus, Jacob suddenly realized that he had developed feelings for Bianca, although he himself did not understand when exactly this happened. From the very beginning, he had tried to compete with Counts Arnaud and Blanchefort, considering it the easiest and most obvious way to make a name for himself. Now, however, Jacob felt almost like a boy discovering love for the first time. The final was soon announced. One of the participants was the Knight of Caestia, the very warrior whom Sauveur had encountered earlier. But the main question remained, who would be his opponent? He had to wait for the opponent's name to appear on the shield. A few minutes later, the public learned that the strong warrior would have to fight the Black Wolf, a knight from the House of Arnaud. The fight promised to be spectacular. The Rock of Castia versus the Mountains of Sevran. Sir Gaspard entered the fray on Arnaud's side. The main rule of the competition was to accurately strike the opponent with a spear in the head, shoulder, or shield. The fight consisted of 3 rounds, and the winner was the one who won 2 of them. If a knight fell from his horse, the duel ended immediately. In controversial situations, the winner was determined by the accuracy of hits and the results of the rounds. If the spear hit its target accurately, it would shatter into pieces, which is exactly what happened when Gaspard attacked his opponent. The knight Arnaud again won the first round. Gaspard was the larger of the two, and if he'd been quicker, he might have unhorsed his opponent. But his opponent wasn't one to be defeated by strength or size alone. It seems the knight from Castia missed the opportunity to knock Gaspard off his horse. If the opponent falls from his horse, the winner will be determined immediately. A few seconds later, Gaspard's opponent deftly directed a sword strike straight towards Arnaud's guard knight. Yvonne watched her favorite's defeat with tears in her eyes. Although Gaspard did not fall from his horse, his condition looked terrible. Judging by his movements, he may have suffered a concussion. The final round between Gaspard and the Knight of Castia ended with the spear being completely destroyed and Gaspard's final defeat. Lady Bianca d'Arnaud could not calmly watch her assistant suffer. Her heart was squeezed with anxiety, so she decisively ordered Yvonne to return with the others, not allowing the situation to escalate further. Meanwhile, the Knight of Castia, beaming like a confident winner, proudly presented a scarlet rose to Her Highness Princess Audrey, as if to cement his victory in the duel and demonstrate respect for the allied side. It looked almost romantic and even theatrical, a knight from Castia presenting a rose to the princess of an allied state, like a scene from an ancient fairy tale about honor, peace, and noble alliances come to life. However, the heroine at that moment was far from romantic and thought only about the consequences of the battle. The warrior from Castia, who defeated Gaspard, would now probably meet either the second prince or the count. Meanwhile, Gaspard was healing his wounds in a secluded tent, hidden from prying eyes, trying not to show the signs of his defeat and recovering his strength after a difficult fight. Only Yvonne came to share his pain. Gaspard was genuinely glad to see her, and, gathering his thoughts, tried to begin confessing his feelings, though he found it difficult to put everything into words. He admitted that his sympathy had arisen ever since Yvonne became the personal assistant of Madame Bianca d'Arnaud, and since then, he had increasingly caught himself thinking about her. Gaspard really wanted to give her a rose today too, the very one that he had long been mentally saving just for her, as a sign of special feeling and sincere attention. Then, Yvonne quietly stepped towards him and hugged him, gently saying that one single rose was enough for her, because his sincere feelings were more important to her than the number of flowers. Meanwhile, Yanka and Sauveur were waiting for the lingering boys behind the stands of the duel field. The knight noted how touchingly the lady cared even for her own personal servant. Sauveur also asked the missus if she wanted to see Zachary d'Arnaud. However, the lady made it clear that Count Zachary d'Arnaud had previously assured her of victory in return, so she had no desire to act so frivolously or show unnecessary impatience. At such moments, Sauveur realized more and more clearly that he was liking her mistress's character more and more. At the same time, he honestly admitted to himself that he hadn't liked his previous mistress at all. The knight also shared that, somewhere around the year before last, he and several other knights had accompanied the count on assignment and even provided him with services related to women, which in their circles was considered something ordinary and almost not worth discussing. There was nothing surprising about this. This was another aristocratic couple, and at the age of the count, he would most likely already have 4 children, because in their world, such a thing was considered the norm and part of the continuation of the family line. But, since the lady was still very young, the question was no longer so much about children as such, but about accelerating the inheritance and the future union of the young people on which the stability of their families depended. At times, it was even thought that an illegitimate child wasn't such a bad option. If by any means an heir could emerge who could continue the count's line, then the House of Arnaud would be safe. Therefore, in her past life, Bianca d'Arnaud allowed a man to have a mistress, perceiving it as a cold calculation and necessity rather than a personal feeling. It turns out that the girl was not at all a replacement for the count. If we look impartially at Bianca d'Arnaud's relationship with Zachary d'Arnaud during that period, those around him could only speak in this way, evaluating their union through the prism of benefit and duty. The current, reborn, Bianca d'Arnaud would, in essence, agree with the thoughts of the people of that time, understanding their logic, even if not sharing it completely. While discussing such unpleasant topics, the knight noticed that his mistress was not at all angry, although the count himself, if he heard something like this, would be furious and would not forgive such a thing, even as a joke. From the day Sovor ran away from home empty-handed, the young man considered himself an adult, but as an adult, he was truly afraid for the first time. The count was very stern, and his anger was terrifyingly terrible, so much so that Sovor would have preferred even the battlefield. And now the knight noticed that the current mistress had become a kind of center of attraction for the Arno family. Connections were gradually being built around her, and people were beginning to look at her differently. And if you think about it, Sovor has already expressed similar thoughts more than once, which means that he truly sincerely believes in this and is not simply repeating other people's words. Moreover, it was obvious that the army men had gradually changed their opinion of their mistress. There appeared those who accepted her as a true mistress and became her reliable support. So since Sovor had this chance, he wanted to apologize to Madame Bianca d'Arnaud. Now he continued to sincerely regret his words, especially the mention of his mistress and illegitimate child, which seemed increasingly inappropriate to him. On his part, these were just stupid thoughts out loud. Now he could not even dream of addressing a lady disrespectfully, because if the lady decided to punish him, he would take it completely seriously and without objection. However, then the conversation unexpectedly went too far, and Sovor nevertheless decided to admit that Count Zachary d'Arnaud had never done anything that could tarnish Bianca's honor. A knight from Arno's guard, observing this, noted that Zachary may appear cold, but he has always treasured only his wife. The count truly knows no other women and does not allow such relationships. Of course, the lady had no intention of punishing the knight harshly for thinking such thoughts out loud. All she did was lightly pat Sovor on the cheeks, softly, almost childishly, turning it into a symbolic punishment. Zachary d'Arnaud himself observed this scene from the sidelines. In the eyes of those around him, Bianca's behavior with the knight looked strange, and even Zachary himself, as a rather jealous husband, did not approve of such familiarity on the part of his guards. However, at that moment, the second prince realized that the count's jealousy could only play into his hands. The man now looked much more emotional than when Jacob tried to provoke him. Finally, the ceremonial signal sounded. The second competition of the quarterfinals had begun, and the host loudly announced His Highness the second Prince Jacob and Count Zachary d'Arnaud as the participants in the decisive duel. At that moment, Zachary was thinking only of his girlfriend. Mr. Arnaud couldn't leave Bianca alone, so he had previously instructed Sovor to stay by her side. However, now his soul was troubled by how close their relationship seemed. Now, Zachary remembered the fact that even Blanchefort's son showed sympathy for Sovor. The knight was truly a gifted speaker and an understanding of people's feelings, and Zachary feared that Bianca might consider him a more suitable companion. After all, Sovor seemed like the kind of guy who constantly made her laugh and rejoice. Zachary's anxious thoughts told him that right now, the knight seemed closer to her than Monsieur Arnaud himself, a stern and reserved man. However, the boy could no longer afford to give in to jealousy and decided to focus on the fight. Therefore, he was the first to attack. Under the pressure of his own emotions, literally a couple of minutes later, Count Zachary d'Arnaud dealt the decisive blow to his opponent, becoming the winner of the final competition. The prince, watching this spectacle, wasn't particularly surprised by the victor, as everyone had expected such strength from Count Zachary d'Arnaud. But now it seemed that even the Knight of Castia, who had reached the finals, was capable of giving him a serious fight, and perhaps winning. At that moment, the king felt no pride in his second son. Jacob had once again become a source of trouble. Although just recently, this impudent man had assured everyone that he would not allow himself to fail. Now, bearing such responsibility turned out to be much heavier than he had expected. At the same moment, Princess Audrey added a remark about how predators always settle scores with their opponents, as if hinting at the hidden cruelty and inevitability of the final confrontation. The guards noted that if one pays attention to how aggressively Count Arno came out against Jacob, this only confirms that his opponent was far from simple, and also posed a serious threat in a duel. Meanwhile, the Count was already carrying his rose for miss. Other aristocrats, every time Zachary won, hoped that he would pay attention to them, but their expectations invariably remained unanswered. But of course, the guy, without a second's hesitation, wanted to share his prize only with his wife. More than anything, Zachary wanted this tournament to finally end so he could leave. However, the hero did not forget to find the positive side. If it were not for this tournament, he would not have had the opportunity to see that special, almost living expression on Bianca's face that he valued so much. Now, Zachary sincerely believed that handing over a flower under the pretext of victory was too awkward a way to express feelings. He himself was constrained in expressing emotions, but this tournament gave him a rare chance to be closer to her. And yet, more than anything, the man wanted to just leave here and take Bianca to a place where no one could look at her or interfere with their personal world. After this, he kissed the lady's hand and asked her to wait a little. He had to finish everything and return to where he could present his soul as it was. At that moment, the hero remembered how he first took Bianca d'Arnaud's hand during the wedding ceremony, when everything between them was just beginning. That day, the man wasn't sure if he could spend his entire life with someone with such a small and fragile hand. Back then, Zachary didn't even fully trust himself. He constantly sought advice from his butler. Literally, every day, he asked Vincent about Bianca's mood and whether everything was all right. That same evening, The butler offered to purchase jewelry of a different shape for the lady. He gently reminded her that the young lady particularly liked one necklace, as her neck had become more graceful and elongated, and the girl herself had noticeably grown and had already reached 15 years of age, gradually transforming from a child into a young lady. Other aristocratic families typically raise their future bride and groom together, as if preparing them for their union from childhood, but in the case of the Arnaud family, such a path proved impossible due to the circumstances and lifestyle of the count. Thus, while Zachary, who had grown up too early and was accustomed to the battlefield, did not notice the image of a small child, his wife gradually and imperceptibly, for him, turned into a young woman, changing every day. One day, he entered his wife's bedroom, and, unexpectedly for himself, noticed how abruptly, and almost imperceptibly for him, Lady Bianca d'Arnaud had transformed from a girl into a real young woman. That day, the knight's gaze first lingered on her high white neck, her graceful curves, and her small scarlet lips. He did not yet know whether the moment would come when he could allow himself to kiss them. Just thinking about it made Zachary shudder slightly, and his memory flashed back to the day he'd first held that small, fragile hand. He hadn't yet realized that this little one, who didn't understand the circumstances, would one day become his wife. The young man felt terrible, although he couldn't explain why. So that day, he decided that he simply had to give Bianca everything she wanted, even if he himself didn't know how to properly express his feelings. Count Zachary d'Arnaud promised himself that he would be responsible for this union, neglecting his own feelings and putting duty above all personal matters. But at the same time, the man believed that his feelings, which only grew stronger as Bianca grew older, should not have developed into something as dangerous and uncontrollable as love, which he could not allow himself to accept. He convinced himself that he needed to cast aside these unnecessary feelings, hide them and endure them, believing that all he needed to do was respect his wife and be there as a protector. Zachary firmly believed that if he was satisfied with their current relationship, he could hide his emotions as much as he wanted, not allowing them to destroy the order and duty on which everything was based. However, fate turned out completely differently, gradually forcing him to go against his own beliefs and destroying everything that he had so carefully built within himself. That shield-like resolve shattered into pieces, and, lost in thoughts of Bianca d'Arnaud, the boy himself didn't notice how he ended up winning the duel. Count Zachary d'Arnaud emerged as the undisputed champion of the knightly tournament, and at that moment, the stand seemed to explode with emotion, because his victory was expected, but still impressive in its impeccable strength and cold precision. And it was at that moment that the boy seemed to begin to understand that without realizing it, he had been expressing his feelings for Bianca d'Arnaud through every blow, every movement, and every decision on the battlefield. His whole body seemed to be screaming something he couldn't put into words. Tension, determination, and tenderness were mixed into one state that he couldn't name, but could no longer ignore. His body made it clear how much he truly valued his girlfriend, and that he was ready to subjugate the whole world, just to protect her fragile shoulders, and stoop down before her, as before the most important person in his life. Now, the man was absolutely certain that he would give his all and even more, if only Bianca d'Arnaud so desired. He carried for the lady that very golden rose, with a warm, almost trembling feeling inside. The boy, as before, was poor at expressing his feelings in words, but now he finally had a way to convey them correctly. As soon as Zachary approached Bianca, the girl seemed to let him know how long she had been waiting for this moment. Lady d'Arnaud was overjoyed at her man's victory. Thanks to Zachary, she had been given a special honor, and he, in turn, felt that he had overcome a difficult battle precisely thanks to her support. Presenting the absolute champion's rose, the guy firmly stated that this victory belongs entirely to Bianca, and he sincerely believes that words alone are not enough to express his gratitude. However, the girl then asked him to prove his gratitude in a different way, to express his feelings with a kiss. Without thinking twice, the man took the lady in his arms and was ready to fulfill her long-awaited desire with complete sincerity and pleasure. It was a tournament that thickly shrouded the count and his wife in rumors and the glances of those around them, turning their every move into a source of conversation and speculation. And with this kiss, they clearly conveyed their message to everyone around them, without words, but much louder than any confessions. The second prince, watching this, noted with envy the strong passion present in the couple of the young master and Lady d'Arnaud, recalling Zachary's words that he would not forgive anyone who tried to harm his beloved wife. Their kiss was hot and insistent, yet surprisingly refined. It was a kiss that perfectly reflected the count himself, strict on the outside, yet deeply sensitive on the inside. After the moment of solitude ended, the man came to his senses a little, and, still under the influence of emotions, decided to carefully ask the lady if she really still wanted an heir, as she had said earlier. As soon as the girl confirmed that she truly wanted a child from Count Zachary d'Arnaud, the man promised to find time that night and do everything possible to fulfill her request, sincerely wanting to give his beloved woman what she spoke of without hesitation. The tournament had come to an end, and everything that had happened seemed almost like a dream, and Laoz was gradually returning to his usual routine, as if the exciting event was dissolving into everyday life. That tournament truly became a special time for testing the feelings of the Count and Countess, when their every action and glance seemed to reveal what had previously remained hidden deep inside. And at the same time, it became a time of great changes in the soul, which had previously been unnoticeable even for the heroes themselves, but now began to manifest themselves more and more clearly. The people, especially tired of the protracted war, were shocked by the Count's overwhelming victory at the tournament, perceiving it as a symbol of strength and hope for the entire country. Everyone admired Zachary, his truly iron blood, and unwavering determination. It seemed that as long as Count d'Arno was in this country, Sevran would win, and the delight of those around him knew no bounds. Besides this, the plan of the story's main character also worked. Bianca successfully advertised her lace, and the aristocrats began to actively whisper about where the Arno family got such a superb thing, which they wanted to get at any cost. Meanwhile, the Count and Countess themselves were already preparing for that long-awaited night when something was to happen between them, something they both came to gradually. Until this moment, the heroes could not fully acknowledge their feelings. Each followed their goals and duties, but now the very moment had finally arrived that changed everything. That night, they desired each other more sincerely than ever before. As soon as Zachary knocked and entered Bianca's room, he saw before him a truly dazzling beauty. First, the young people sat on the bed, and the man carefully decided to clarify whether Bianca really wanted everything to happen that night. Zachary was worried that he might scare her by suddenly announcing his arrival. Although, in fact, this wasn't the only thing that worried Zachary. Bianca hadn't expected him to kiss her in such a public place anyway, and this knocked her out of her usual state of calm. And even if she tried to remain calm then, because of the guy's actions, Miss still found herself in an extremely awkward situation, which she tried to comprehend for a long time. Although at the same time, the girl also understood that they were not just friends or strangers, but future spouses. And in their situation, such closeness is a natural part of their relationship, which over time becomes not only normal, but also necessary for their connection. When Zachary said he would visit her that night, Bianca may have misinterpreted his words, and now she didn't want to get her hopes up too high, and then face disappointment and her own worries. All this time, the young man considered himself patient and was confident that he could wait as long as Bianca needed, without rushing her and respecting her inner rhythm and feelings. But the knight's vaunted endurance, which he had cultivated for so long, literally fell apart, as if it had encountered an insurmountable wall of emotions in his own feelings. Bianca had never known all the feelings that were hidden deep inside the man. It seemed to her that if he could one day openly tell everything that tormented him, they would both feel much better and calmer. That night, Zachary asked his wife to call him by his first name instead of Count, because for him, this was an important step towards a closer and more sincere relationship, where Bianca could one day call him simply beloved. The guy didn't put any pressure on the beauty at all. He only repeated once that night that if the girl didn't want intimacy, she could always refuse, and that now was the perfect time to stop everything if she felt uncomfortable. At that moment, it seemed to the heroine that if she pushed the Count away now, she would never get a second chance, and this thought simultaneously frightened her and made her doubt herself even more. Initially, the heroine really wanted to quickly give birth to an heir for the sake of her well-being and future stability, considering this as part of her duty and plan for life. But now, in the Count's arms, and barely containing her own feelings, Bianca was afraid that if they ever broke through, they would only become stronger and deeper than before. However, Bianca had fallen so deeply in love with this man that she no longer wanted to push him away, accepting her emotions and allowing them to gradually overcome her fear. By her decision and inner consent, the guy slowly began to help her release excess tension and carefully reduce the distance between them, acting carefully and attentively. The man was not at all embarrassed by the fact that my lady was dressed in many layers of clothing. On the contrary, he perceived this as a natural protection of her modesty and inner comfort, which he did not want to abruptly violate. Besides, he knew that if Bianca looked even a little unsure or disheveled, he wouldn't have the slightest chance of earning her trust and consent at that moment. Now the time had come when the young people were as close to each other as possible, and Zachary, with slight excitement and warm attention, could carefully ask the lady to help him, sharing with him this important and very personal moment.